By 800 BC, the landscapes of Britain and Gaul were shifting under new pressures of migration, climate variation, and expanding trade networks that threaded copper, tin, and salt across Western Europe. Settlements grew along river valleys where stratigraphic layers now preserved the charcoal traces of seasonal forges, the faint outlines of roundhouses, and the first organized enclosures that marked the rise of social hierarchies. Excavations at sites such as Dainbury Hillfort and the Opida of central France indicate a gradual consolidation of power among ritual specialists who controlled knowledge rather than territory, shaping communal identity through oral memory, astronomical observation, and the arbitration of law. Their presence appears indirectly through material culture, ogham-like prescript markings, standardized sacrificial deposits, and ceremonial groves aligned to solstice light. Meanwhile, Roman authors would later describe them as Druids, a learned class whose influence extended across tribes and regions, binding disparate groups under shared systems of cosmology and governance. Archaeological evidence suggests that their authority emerged from mastery of tradition at a moment when decentralized societies required mediators who could interpret natural cycles and arbitrate disputes. The civilization shaped by these figures matters because it represents one of the most sophisticated non-literate intellectual traditions in ancient Europe, preserved not in texts, but in landscape, ritual, and memory. Continue as we examine how environment, ritual authority, and evolving social structures shape the world's most influential Iron Age intellectual tradition. By 800 BC, the western fringes of Europe experienced subtle yet measurable shifts in climate, visible today in peat core samples from Ireland and sediment layers across the Thames Valley. Cooler summers and increased rainfall altered crop cycles and encouraged communities to adapt their settlement strategies to ensure stability through unpredictable seasons. Excavations at Dainbury Hillfort reveal thickened ramparts, reorganized storage pits, and a rising emphasis on grain preservation, suggesting that communities prioritized collective security and long-term planning. Meanwhile, small enclosures began to appear along river terraces where charcoal traces from early iron smelting hearths indicate experimentation with new metallurgical methods. The faint metallic scent that still clings to exposed slag deposits offers a sensory reminder of how transformative these technologies were for societies accustomed to bronze. Archaeological evidence suggests that this period marked a decisive shift toward regional specialization, with upland areas focusing on herding while lowland fields increasingly supported cereal agriculture. These changes created interdependencies that encouraged negotiation, ritual exchange, and the emergence of individuals skilled in managing social memory. The gradual consolidation of authority within fortified settlements reflects not only economic necessity, but a cultural desire for structures capable of stabilizing communities during environmental fluctuation. Stratigraphic data from sites across Gaul demonstrate similar patterns of consolidation, showing repeated phases of ditch recutting and rampart reinforcement between 800 and 700 BC. These labor-intensive projects required coordination beyond the household level, implying the presence of leaders who could organize seasonal labor and oversee communal efforts. Meanwhile, ritual deposits in wetlands, carefully placed weapons, ornaments, and animal remains indicate that societies relied on ceremonial acts to maintain equilibrium between the demands of environment and community. Excavations at Gournay-sur-Aronde show deliberate placement of spears and shields in shallow pits, their arrangement implying structured rites rather than random offerings. The sound of wind moving across these open landscapes, once punctuated by the metallic resonance of such rituals, reinforces the sensory reality that ceremony was woven into agricultural cycles. Evidence suggests that these acts formed part of a broader worldview in which natural forces required continuous negotiation. As a result, individuals versed in ancestral lore and environmental interpretation gained credibility. This proto-elite did not yet resemble the Druids described by classical authors, but the foundations of later Druidic authority, knowledge, mediation, observation, were present in these early ritual specialists. Meanwhile, the spread of iron technology accelerated social complexity. Metallurgical analysis from Hilfort workshops indicates that smiths developed increasingly standardized techniques for forging sickles, spearheads, and knives, creating tools more durable than their bronze predecessors. These innovations allowed deeper ploughing, expanded food production, and supported population growth across Britain and Gaul. As communities grew more interconnected through trade in iron, salt, and livestock, the need for shared norms intensified. Archaeological surveys of long-distance trackways, particularly those linking Wessex to the continental coast, reveal sustained movement of goods and ideas. This expanding network encouraged cultural harmonization, laying the groundwork for later Celtic linguistic cohesion. Within this environment, those capable of interpreting tradition and preserving intertribal relationships gained prominence. Evidence from burial sites shows individuals buried with objects suggesting roles in mediation or ritual guidance, hinting at emerging forms of specialized authority. The gradual accumulation of such responsibilities forms a conceptual bridge toward the fully developed intellectual class that would later be identified as Druids. The archaeological record also reveals increasing concern for astronomical and seasonal observance. Although monumental structures like Stonehenge belong to earlier eras, smaller timber circles from the early Iron Age demonstrate continued attention to celestial events. Excavations in the Upper Severn Valley show alignments corresponding to solstice sunrises, reinforcing the argument that communities continued to embed cosmological meaning in architecture. The faint grain of weathered timber impressions preserved in soil layers provides a tactile reminder of how ritual structures once shaped communal rhythms. These ceremonial spaces required individuals capable of interpreting sky patterns and integrating them into agricultural planning. Such knowledge, preserved through oral tradition, gradually became institutionalized. Radiocarbon analysis places many of these ritual constructions between 750 and 650 BC, precisely when settlement hierarchies were strengthening. This temporal convergence suggests that environmental challenges, social consolidation, and expanding ritual systems combined to produce a class of knowledge keepers whose influence extended beyond isolated communities. Their authority emerged not through coercion, but through mastery of knowledge that stabilized cultural identity during a period of increasing complexity. Across Britain and Gaul, the landscape itself became a stabilizing framework for communities adjusting to new climatic rhythms. Pollen analysis from upland bogs in Scotland and central France indicates cycles of forest clearance followed by controlled regrowth, suggesting deliberate land management strategies rather than simple exploitation. These patterns reveal communities experimenting with sustainable zones of pasture and cultivation, creating environmental mosaics that required coordination across extended kin groups. Excavations at settlements such as Must Farm, though belonging partly to the late Bronze and early Iron Age interface, show how waterlogged environments preserved traces of woven textiles, worked wood, and plant remains, offering insight into daily life shaped by practical adaptation. The subtle scent of damp earth and ancient grain that lingers in these preserved layers serves as a sensory link to the occupations that defined survival. As these interconnected systems grew more sophisticated, individuals capable of guiding seasonal planning gained increasing influence. Archaeological evidence suggests that early ritual specialists likely advised on the timing of planting, harvest festivals, and rites intended to renew the community's relationship with natural cycles. Their authority stemmed from an ability to interpret continuity when environmental cues shifted unpredictably. Stratified hillfort layers across the region indicate that population density increased during the centuries between 800 and 600 BC. This demographic pressure is visible in intensified use of storage pits, expanded internal enclosures, and the construction of additional defensive banks over earlier ones. At Danebury, for example, repeated rebuilding of ramparts over generations reflects both practical needs and symbolic assertions of territorial identity. Meanwhile, isotopic analysis of cattle and sheep remains suggests expanding herding ranges that required communal regulation. These material traces imply that leadership roles evolved to include conflict resolution, trade oversight, and ritual sanctioning of agreements. As the social web thickened, Groups needed frameworks for managing disputes without destabilizing alliances. The archaeological distribution of feasting sites, recognized through concentrations of animal bones and high-quality ceramics, shows gatherings that likely served both social and political functions. The smoke that once drifted from open hearths during these events, now preserved only as microscopic residues on pottery, reminds us that public gatherings were structured spaces where authority could be affirmed and ritual memory reinforced. Over time, such occasions provided a platform for individuals who mediated tradition, ensuring continuity amid growing complexity. The emergence of regional styles in metalwork and pottery also reveals increasing cultural coherence. Latin motifs, although reaching their peak centuries later, have early precursors in geometric designs that appear across Britain and northern France during this period. These shared aesthetic choices point toward a cultural network facilitated by exchange routes and intermarriage among neighboring groups. Excavations in Normandy and Kent show similar burial practices, including carefully arranged grave goods that reflect belief systems emphasizing ancestry and continuity. Radiocarbon analysis places many of these burials in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, aligning with rising social stratification. Such graves often include items associated with status, such as finely crafted torques or weapons deliberately bent before placement. The practice of ritual deformation, well documented at Gournay-sur-Aronde, suggests that symbolic acts played a central role in how people understood power and obligation. These acts required an interpretive class capable of explaining their significance, and their repeated appearance across regions hints at the early formation of shared ideological frameworks. Over generations, these frameworks would consolidate into a coherent intellectual tradition recognizable as the groundwork of later Druidic thought. The evidence for early sanctuaries further strengthens this picture. Excavations in Brittany and the Ardennes have revealed timber-lined enclosures with central pits containing deliberately placed offerings. These deposits often include animal bones arranged in patterns not typical of butchery or domestic disposal, indicating ritual contexts. Charcoal from associated hearths shows controlled burning events rather than accidental fires, suggesting structured ceremonies. The faint pattern of burnt soil layers preserved beneath later activity provides a direct sensory link to gatherings that once filled these spaces with movement and sound. Radiocarbon dating consistently situates these sanctuaries in the centuries preceding the widespread documentation of Druids, implying that ritual centers served as anchors for social memory long before the rise of named officiants. Within these spaces, early ritual specialists likely recited genealogies, oversaw rites of passage, and maintained the cosmological narratives that held communities together. Their authority was not yet formalized, but the trajectory toward institutionalized knowledge is evident in the increasing complexity of these ceremonial sites. By the end of the 7th century BC, Britain and Gaul had developed interconnected cultural landscapes supported by trade, fortified settlements, and consistent ritual practices. Archaeological syntheses across these regions demonstrate a gradual alignment of belief systems, aesthetic traditions, and social roles. This alignment provided fertile ground for the emergence of a formal intellectual class capable of preserving tradition through oral memory and ritual expertise. The transition from local ritual leaders to the Druids of historical record did not occur suddenly, but evolved through centuries of incremental development shaped by climate, technology, and social necessity. As these forces converged, they produced a society ready for the consolidation of religious and legal authority that would define the next stage of Iron Age cultural evolution. Across the river systems of Britain and Gaul, environmental data reveals another factor that influenced early Iron Age societies: the gradual shift in hydrology that altered flood patterns and encouraged new settlement strategies. Core samples from the Seine basin display alternating bands of silt and organic material, marking cycles of high water events between 750 and 650 BC. Communities adapted by elevating dwellings, reinforcing embankments, and situating granaries on higher ground where airflow preserved stored grain. Excavations at sites in the Upper Thames demonstrate an increased use of raised wooden platforms, their post holes still visible as darkened soil circles arranged in careful symmetry. The faint texture of preserved grain impressions found in some storage pits offers a tactile reminder of societies that layered adaptation with tradition. These changes required coordinated planning, and individuals with knowledge of seasonal cycles gained increasing authority as advisors. Archaeological evidence suggests that these early planners, while not yet the Druids described by classical authors, performed functions that stabilized communities by aligning human activity with environmental rhythms. Material culture from this period further reveals expanding cultural networks across Western Europe. Metallurgical analysis of iron artifacts from hill forts in central France indicates that ore sources were sometimes located more than 100 kilometers away, implying long-distance exchange routes. The movement of these raw materials required negotiation among groups with overlapping territories. Archaeological surveys along the Loire and Rhône show pathways worn into bedrock, likely used for transporting goods between settlements. The soft echo of footsteps that would have once traveled these routes now lingers only in the physical traces left behind. Such corridors facilitated not only the movement of commodities, but also the transmission of ritual knowledge and shared practices. Evidence from pottery styles, particularly the spread of early patterned ceramics, suggests cultural convergence between Britain and Gaul during this period. This convergence created a unified symbolic landscape in which ritual specialists could operate across regions, establishing early forms of intellectual cohesion. Meanwhile, burial evidence provides additional insight into the social transformations between 800 and 600 BC. Excavations in eastern England and northern France reveal graves with standardized orientations, often accompanied by personal ornaments and tools. Deliberate inclusion of items such as ring-headed pins or decorated scabbards demonstrates continuity of identity beyond death. Radiocarbon analysis of these burials aligns them with the period of expanding hill fort construction, suggesting that communities placed increased emphasis on remembering ancestral lines and reinforcing social hierarchy. The stillness of these burial spaces, preserved across millennia, offers a sensory contrast to the dynamic settlements from which they originated. Such graves likely served not only as markers of status, but as focal points for ritual gatherings where genealogies were recited and communal memory renewed. The individuals who presided over such ceremonies played central roles in reinforcing social cohesion and transmitting tradition. Their functions align closely with proto-Druidic responsibilities later attested in classical sources, indicating that the foundations of Druidic authority were embedded deeply in the mortuary practices of the early Iron Age. Ritualized deposition of objects in natural settings also increased during this period. Wetland sites across Britain and Gaul contain carefully placed offerings, including weapons, pottery, and animal remains arranged with deliberate precision. Excavations at Llanfowr in Wales uncovered a significant hoard containing tools and weapons, each item placed in ways suggesting ceremonial intent rather than disposal. The cold, still water that once enveloped these offerings created an environment where bronze and early iron objects were preserved with remarkable clarity, allowing modern archaeologists to reconstruct patterns of ritual behavior that emphasize respect for natural forces. These acts demonstrate that communities engaged in structured exchanges with their environment, treating lakes, rivers, and bogs as places where communication with ancestral or divine powers could occur. The specialists who organized these rites gained authority through their ability to mediate between natural and human worlds, a role central to the later identity of Druids. By 600 BC, the cumulative effects of climate adaptation, technological development, ritual codification, and expanding social networks had created a cultural environment primed for institutionalized knowledge. The archaeological record shows increasingly complex settlement hierarchies, widespread ritual practices, and growing interregional communication. These elements formed the substrate from which the Druidic class would emerge, uniting spiritual, legal, and intellectual responsibilities into a coherent system. As the Iron Age advanced, this system would shape identity across Britain and Gaul, providing stability during centuries of shifting alliances and external pressures. The next chapter explores how these early ritual specialists formalized their roles, establishing the foundations of authority that would define the Druids of the classical world. As settlement systems matured across Britain and Gaul, the archaeological record shows a noticeable refinement in domestic architecture and community planning. Excavations at sites such as Caburn and Hod Hill reveal increasingly standardized roundhouse designs with carefully laid postrings and structured internal spaces for hearths, storage, and craft work. The circular form, preserved in the soil as rings of compacted clay and shadowed post holes, reflects a worldview in which the household served as a microcosm of seasonal and communal order. Radiocarbon analysis places many of these structures between 650 and 600 BC, aligning them with evidence of expanding population clusters. Meanwhile, the distribution of quern stones across settlement layers indicates heightened cereal processing, suggesting that agriculture had become sufficiently productive to support denser communities. The faint residue of ground grain left on some stones provides a sensory reminder of daily labor that sustained these societies. These domestic improvements reflect not only technological change, but a developing social framework in which knowledge about construction, storage, and craft was increasingly specialized. Over time, the need to coordinate such skills reinforced the authority of those who maintained ritual calendars and governed communal decisions. Ritual spaces from this period also display growing architectural complexity, suggesting an emerging sense of institutionalized ceremonial life. Excavations at sites in Champagne and the Ardennes have uncovered wooden galleries and fenced enclosures that indicate controlled access to sacred areas. These structures, defined by parallel lines of truncated post holes, reveal spaces where processions or rites likely unfolded in regulated sequences. The controlled movement implied by these architectural features parallels practices found in other non-literate societies, where ritual knowledge depends on spatial choreography. Charcoal samples from associated hearths show repeated burning episodes timed across seasons rather than continuous occupation, suggesting structured ceremonial calendars. The smell of aged charcoal extracted from these layers evokes the rhythm of long-extinguished fires that once marked transitions within the agricultural year. Such settings required individuals capable of interpreting cosmological significance, sanctioning ritual behavior, and maintaining continuity through oral instruction. These responsibilities foreshadow the formalized roles of Druids, whose later authority depended on mastery of both spatial and temporal order within ceremonial life. Interregional communication further strengthened the ideological foundation upon which Druidic authority would later stand. Analysis of metalworking styles demonstrates increasing uniformity across regions separated by considerable distances. Proliferation of socketed spearheads, ring-headed pins, and standardized iron tools points to shared technical knowledge that spread through trade and kinship networks. Archaeological surveys along the English Channel reveal clusters of settlements oriented toward maritime exchange, supported by evidence of imported goods, such as fine ceramics and exotic pigments. The presence of these items in inland sites, often found within ritual contexts, suggests that material exchange carried symbolic weight. The faint sheen of mineral-based pigments preserved in ceramic residues hints at ceremonial functions involving color and adornment, practices likely guided by ritual specialists. These networks offered pathways not only for goods, but for ideas concerning law, cosmology, and social order. As these pathways expanded, they created a cultural environment in which a trans-regional intellectual class could operate, transmitting shared knowledge across tribal boundaries. By the closing decades of the 7th century BC, Britain and Gaul had become increasingly interlinked through systems of exchange, ritual practice, and shared aesthetic traditions. The archaeological record demonstrates that societies across both regions developed recurrent forms of symbolic expression, including deposition patterns, architectural choices, and burial customs. These recurrences imply that communities participated in a broader cultural dialogue mediated by individuals who managed ritual authority. The environmental pressures, technological advancements, and social restructuring that unfolded between 800 and 600 BC created conditions that demanded interpreters of tradition, figures who would eventually evolve into the Druids documented by classical authors. Their emergence was not the sudden appearance of an elite class, but the culmination of centuries of adaptation in which knowledge became the primary resource for social cohesion. As these trends converged, they prepared the cultural landscape for the rise of a formal intellectual order that would shape the identity of Iron Age Europe in the centuries to come. The transition from this foundational era into the next phase marks the moment when scattered ritual specialists began to assume clear social roles, their responsibilities expanding alongside the needs of increasingly complex communities. The development of identifiable centers of learning, the deepening importance of oral tradition, and the formalization of ceremonial authority would characterize this evolution. These transformations set the stage for the emergence of a distinct intellectual class, whose influence would permeate every aspect of Iron Age life, guiding political alliances, mediating conflicts, and preserving cultural memory. Between 700 and 500 BC, the cultural landscapes of Britain and Gaul reveal a decisive transition from loosely structured ritual practices toward a more recognizable class of ceremonial and intellectual authorities. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries across Brittany, the Paris Basin, and the Upper Thames Valley points to the increasing regularity of ceremonial construction, suggesting that ritual leadership was becoming a defined social role rather than a diffuse communal responsibility. Excavations at Gournay-sur-Aronde and Riedmont-sur-Ancre display carefully engineered enclosures with aligned entrances, standardized offering pits, and structured deposition of weapons and animal remains. The arrangement of these deposits, often placed in linear patterns or grouped by type, indicates ceremonial protocols guided by individuals who understood symbolic grammar. The faint marks left by wooden posts, visible as darker stains in the soil, provide a sensory reminder of timber structures that once shaped movement, sound, and visibility within sacred spaces. Such settings required specialists who managed not only rites, but the narrative frameworks that gave those rites meaning. Their authority emerged through mastery of genealogy, seasonal cycles, and ancestral memory, forming the foundational functions later associated with the Druids. While material culture cannot identify names or titles, the consistency of ritual forms suggests an emerging intellectual network. Stratigraphic data from multiple sites shows repeated rebuilding of ceremonial enclosures across generations, implying long-term custodianship of sacred spaces. These reconstructions often followed the same ground plan, demonstrating continuity of ritual knowledge transmitted within select lineages. Radiocarbon analysis places many of these construction phases within the 7th and 6th centuries BC, precisely when communities were expanding and interregional connections were strengthening. The controlled burning layers found within some sanctuaries, preserved as thin black horizontals in the soil, evoke the sensory atmosphere of ceremonies where fire, smoke, and recitation guided communal memory. Such contexts reveal the presence of individuals capable of interpreting cosmological cycles and prescribing appropriate rites, mediating between natural forces and social stability. Their influence grew not through domination, but through the capacity to articulate tradition, regulate ritual behavior, and maintain a shared understanding of order. The emergence of ritual specialists is also visible in the organization of hill forts and regional gathering places. Excavations at large fortified sites such as Bibracte, though later in their development, have earlier precursors in the 6th century whose internal zoning reflects differentiated social roles. The placement of storage pits in distinct clusters, separated from domestic areas, implies monitored resource control. Meanwhile, the presence of large communal buildings, identified through post-string architecture, indicates spaces used for assemblies or ritual gatherings. Soil micromorphology reveals compacted floors consistent with repeated foot traffic, suggesting that these interiors hosted significant events. The cool, still air preserved in subterranean chambers now contrasts with the soundscape that once resonated through these structures, where ritual specialists likely presided over deliberations. Their ability to settle disputes, interpret omens, and legitimized decisions contributed to the gradual centralization of authority across tribal groups. Such figures formed a bridge between leadership based on kinship and emerging intellectual leadership founded on knowledge. Evidence of formalized ceremonial calendars also begins to appear during this period. Pollen analysis from sacred groves indicates cycles of selective tree management, particularly involving oak and yew species, which later classical authors associated with Druidic rites. The careful preservation of these groves, visible through the absence of agricultural disturbance in their pollen signatures, shows that certain landscapes were intentionally maintained as ritual zones. The filtered light that once fell through dense canopies would have created a sensory environment distinct from domestic or agricultural spaces, marking these groves as places of instruction and initiation. Such environmental management required long-term custodianship and suggests that ritual specialists oversaw continuity across generations. Their role in structuring ceremonial landscapes points to a growing system of knowledge in which topography, botany, and cosmology intersected. The significance of these groves within cultural memory helps explain why later Druids adopted them as central spaces of teaching and worship. The rise of proto-Druidic roles is also evident in the increasingly complex symbolic patterns of deposition found in rivers and wetlands. Excavations along the Seine, Ouse, and Shannon show weapon deposits arranged in deliberate groupings, often accompanied by animal remains or crafted ornaments. These deposits follow consistent patterns across regions separated by significant distances, suggesting shared ritual logic. The cold clarity of preserved river sediments, where metallic sheen still clings to corroded edges of blades, evokes the atmosphere in which such offerings were made. These acts required interpretive specialists who understood the meaning of depositing objects in liminal environments, thresholds between human and natural worlds. Their authority stemmed from the capacity to mediate these exchanges and ensure that the relationship between community and landscape remained stable. Over time, these responsibilities coalesced into formalized teachings that shaped the proto-Druidic intellectual tradition. The consolidation of ritual authority between 700 and 500 BC becomes even clearer when examining early ceremonial centers, where processional routes and controlled access structures were deliberately engineered to guide participants through stages of ritual action. Excavations at the Viereck-Schanzen enclosures of southern Germany and their parallels in Gaul reveal rectilinear timber settings with narrow entrances leading into interior courts. Although these sites slightly postdate the earliest proto-Druidic horizon, their architectural lineage can be traced to earlier circular sanctuaries in Britain and northwestern France. Soil discolorations marking palisade lines and shallow ritual pits show that these spaces were designed to limit sightlines, controlling what was seen and by whom. The sensory effect of moving from open landscape into enclosed ritual corridors suggests a carefully curated experience, one that required trained authorities to regulate ceremony. These architectural strategies imply an emerging ritual hierarchy in which selected individuals, likely proto-Druids, guided participants through acts that reinforced social cohesion and cosmological order. Radiocarbon evidence situates this phase of ritual elaboration squarely within the period of increasing social complexity documented across Britain and Gaul. The growing importance of oral knowledge also shaped the authority of ritual specialists. Linguistic reconstruction of early Celtic dialects indicates that by the 6th century BC, the linguistic landscape had become sufficiently unified to support complex oral narratives shared across regions. This coherence allowed ritual specialists to develop structured bodies of instruction that could be transmitted without writing. Ethnographic parallels with other non-literate intellectual traditions suggest memorization techniques involving rhythmic speech, genealogical sequencing, and spatial memory anchored in ceremonial sites. The low hum of repetitive recitations, once echoing through groves or timber halls, is preserved today only in the spatial organization of those sites and the cultural patterns that formed around them. Archaeological evidence of repeated rebuilding and reoccupation of key ritual landscapes implies that communities relied on experts capable of maintaining oral archives over generations. These specialists became custodians of law, and cosmology, a triad of responsibilities that later classical accounts attribute directly to Druids. Another indicator of emerging proto-Druidic roles lies in the standardization of cosmological symbolism. Early Latin motifs, which appear during the later part of this period, draw from geometric and curvilinear traditions that circulated widely across Britain and Gaul. Although their meanings are not fully recoverable, patterns found on metal objects, ceramics, and carved wooden artifacts suggest shared metaphors for cycles, transitions, and connections between realms. Excavations at sanctuaries in northern France reveal carved posts and decorated beams featuring spiral motifs that likely held cosmological significance. The faint traces of pigment embedded in these carvings evoke ceremonies in which light, color, and movement reinforced oral teachings. Such consistency in symbolism across distant regions implies the operation of intellectual networks that communicated shared ideas. The individuals who preserved and interpreted these symbols formed the nucleus of what would become a coherent Druidic tradition. Their ability to encode cosmology into art, architecture, and action established enduring frameworks for communal identity. Ritual control over warfare begins to appear in the archaeological record during this period, suggesting that proto-Druidic specialists played a role in regulating conflict. Depositions of deliberately damaged weapons in sanctuaries, especially at Gurney-sur-Aronde, indicate ceremonies that formalized the end of battles or consecrated captured arms. Weapon fragments aligned in radial patterns or grouped by type imply intentional choreography guided by ritual rules. The cold gleam of iron blades recovered from these pits, often bearing distinct marks of ceremonial destruction, reflects the intersection of martial and religious spheres. Such practices stabilized intertribal relations by providing structured means of concluding hostilities. The specialists who oversaw these rites wielded influence not through force, but through the authority of tradition, shaping early ethical frameworks of warfare. Classical authors later noted that Druids could intervene between armies, a role that can be traced to these early practices rooted in ritual mediation. By the mid-6th century BC, evidence points to increasing institutionalization of ritual knowledge. Sacred groves, timber enclosures, processional paths, and ceremonial centers operated within a shared symbolic grammar recognizable across regions. Archaeological syntheses show that communities maintained these landscapes over generations, relying on specialists who preserved continuity and interpreted change. These proto-Druidic figures had not yet developed the full philosophical and legal functions documented in later centuries, but their influence had expanded significantly. They regulated rites, preserved oral memory, mediated conflict, and guided interactions with the natural world. Their authority emerged from a deep relationship with landscape, ancestry, and tradition, forming the intellectual groundwork upon which classical Druidism would later rise. The stage was set for a transformation in which oral knowledge, cosmology, and ritual expertise would crystallize into a sophisticated intellectual order. As networks expanded and societies grew more complex, the functions of these specialists deepened, evolving into a system that integrated law, learning, and religious authority. This evolution marks the transition into the next chapter, where linguistic coherence and memory systems reveal the intellectual infrastructure that enabled Druids to wield influence across vast regions. The authority of proto-Druidic figures becomes even more apparent when examining the structured use of landscape as a repository of memory. Across Britain and Gaul, archaeological surveys show that sacred sites were arranged in patterns that linked rivers, hilltops, groves, and enclosures into coherent ritual networks. These connections were not accidental. Rather, they formed a spatial grammar through which communities organized their understanding of time, ancestry, and cosmology. Excavations at multiple hilltop sanctuaries reveal entrance orientations aligned to specific solar events, particularly midsummer sunrise or midwinter sunset. The sharp angles preserved in the remaining post holes allow archaeologists to reconstruct these alignments with remarkable precision. The warm glow that once entered through narrow ceremonial corridors at solstice moments provided sensory markers for seasonal transitions, anchoring ritual cycles in natural phenomena. Such integration of astronomy and landscape required skilled interpreters who could maintain calendars without written records. Their proficiency in coordinating communal rites across years and generations strengthened their position within society, signaling the maturation of an intellectual class emerging from earlier ritual traditions. Material continuity across distant regions further illuminates the shared symbolic language these specialists helped sustain. The spread of specific artifact types, such as intricately decorated scabbards, ring-headed pins, and patterned ceramics, reveals networks of exchange that relied on mutual recognition of cultural markers. Excavations in the Loire Valley and the Seven regions show that such objects often appear in contexts associated with feasting or ceremonial gatherings. Residue analysis from pottery fragments indicates the presence of fermented beverages and herb mixtures, suggesting that these gatherings served not only social but ritual functions. The subtle scent of ancient residues released during laboratory heating procedures offers a sensory link to communal events where ritual specialists likely presided. Their guidance ensured that feasting reinforced social alliances, transmitted oral teachings, and reaffirmed communal identity. Over time, these events became institutionalized, creating predictable settings where proto-Druids exercised intellectual authority and reinforced cultural cohesion. The archaeological record also points to the emergence of teaching traditions that required long periods of apprenticeship. Evidence from repeated architectural rebuilding at certain sanctuaries suggests that custodianship remained within select lineages over centuries. Soil micromorphology reveals layers of trampling consistent with repeated ceremonial use, indicating that these sites served as long-term centers for training ritual officiants. The quiet, enclosed atmosphere reconstructed from the surviving architectural footprints suggests spaces designed for concentrated instruction. Ethnographic parallels with oral intellectual traditions in early India and Greece indicate that such environments would have supported extended memorization practices, philosophical dialogues, and the transmission of legal frameworks. Although no written texts survive from this period, the archaeological continuity and ceremonial complexity imply that proto-Druidic trainees engaged in structured learning that prepared them for roles requiring extensive mastery of history, ritual, and cosmology. Their training ensured that knowledge remained stable across generations, even as societies expanded and encountered new challenges. At the same time, the role of ritual specialists in mediating access to natural resources becomes visible in settlement archaeology. Excavations in the Marne region and the Upper Thames reveal that communities managed pastures, fields, and forest clearings through coordinated seasonal cycles. These cycles required guidance from individuals who tracked environmental changes and integrated them into communal decision-making. The patterns of burned plant remains found in hearth contexts show selective clearing and controlled woodland management, implying intentional strategies shaped by ecological knowledge. The faint earthy aroma released when these remains are examined under laboratory conditions offers a sensory echo of carefully managed landscapes. Proto-Druidic specialists likely oversaw these practices, reinforcing their position as intermediaries between community and environment. Their authority was rooted not in coercion, but in expertise, creating a foundation for the Druids' later roles as advisors in matters of agriculture, law, and diplomacy. By 500 BC, the intellectual structures developed by proto-Druidic authorities had become integral to the stability of many communities across Britain and Gaul. Ceremonial landscapes, standardized symbolic traditions, oral memory systems, and ecological knowledge all converged to form a cohesive framework of authority grounded in ritual and learning. The archaeological record demonstrates that these specialists were no longer occasional officiants, but established figures whose influence extended across regional networks. Their evolving responsibilities prepared the way for the emergence of the Druids known from classical accounts, teachers, judges, philosophers, and interpreters of tradition who shaped Iron Age Celtic society. As the next century unfolded, the intellectual infrastructure they created would expand into a sophisticated oral tradition capable of preserving lore, history, and cosmology without dependence on writing. This transition marks the threshold of a new cultural era in which language, memory, and ritual became the central pillars of Druidic power. Between 600 and 300 BC, the societies of Britain and Gaul entered a phase of linguistic consolidation that transformed the intellectual landscape of the Celtic world. Archaeological evidence reveals expanding networks of exchange linking hill forts, river valleys, and coastal settlements, and these networks facilitated the gradual alignment of regional dialects into a coherent Celtic linguistic sphere. Although the language itself survives only in later inscriptions and reconstructed forms, its influence can be traced indirectly through shared material culture, recurring ritual patterns, and synchronized ceremonial calendars. Excavations at sites such as Manching, Bibracte, and Stanwick demonstrate increasing standardization in pottery design and metalwork that reflects common symbolic vocabularies. The recurring spiral and trumpet-shaped motifs carved into scabbards and torques suggest that abstract ideas, cycles, transitions, and hierarchical order were widely understood. The smooth curvature of these motifs, still visible on corroded bronze surfaces, offers a sensory link to the artisans whose craft encoded cosmological ideas into portable objects. The spread of such imagery across vast distances implies that knowledge specialists operated within a unified intellectual tradition, transmitting concepts orally through formal instruction. This period marks the true emergence of a structured oral training system that later classical authors ascribed to the Druids. Although no written records survive from Celtic hands, the archaeological continuity of ceremonial centers suggests stable institutions dedicated to the preservation of memory. Stratigraphy at sanctuaries in Burgundy and central Britain reveals repeated construction phases, with each generation rebuilding enclosures on earlier footprints. The compacted surfaces of these ritual floors, preserved through layers of use, indicate spaces where instruction likely occurred away from agricultural or domestic activity. Ethnographic parallels with early Greek rhapsodes and Vedic priestly schools illuminate how such spaces could support long-term apprenticeships centered on memorization, philosophical discourse, and legal recitation. The quiet stillness reconstructed from these architectural remains, broken only by the imagined cadence of formal speech, evokes settings where memory became both a discipline and a ritual act. This training system transformed oral knowledge from a communal resource into a specialized craft, establishing the cognitive infrastructure that enabled Druids to retain vast bodies of lore, genealogy, and cosmology without written aids. The archaeological record further supports the existence of organized oral transmission through patterns of feasting that served as communal stages for public recitation. Excavations at feasting complexes, particularly in the Paris Basin and the Upper Thames region, reveal concentrations of animal bones, high-status ceramics, and imported goods that point to large-scale gatherings. Residue analysis on pottery shows traces of fermented beverages and aromatic herbs, suggesting ceremonies involving consumption, storytelling, and ritual reaffirmation. The faint sweetness released from residue samples in laboratory experiments provides a sensory reminder of events where narrative performance shaped collective identity. At such gatherings, proto-Druids and early Druids likely delivered genealogies, recounted mythic histories, and issued rulings that reinforced social cohesion. These events served not only to bind communities, but to embed the authority of memory in public consciousness. The consistent recurrence of these sites across centuries implies that oral teaching was integrated into the rhythm of communal life, linking knowledge with celebration, oath-taking, and seasonal transitions. Between 600 and 400 BC, hill forts grew into regional centers that supported the intellectual expansion of this oral tradition. Excavations at major sites such as Danebury, Maiden Castle, and Mont Lassois reveal administrative zones, craft districts, and ritual areas that indicate sustained population density and social complexity. The spatial organization of these settlements, storage pits arranged in patterned clusters, craft workshops near central pathways, and ceremonial structures positioned at elevated vantage points, reflects deliberate planning guided by individuals with knowledge of communal needs, seasonal cycles, and ritual obligations. Soil micromorphology shows repeated trampling in large interior structures, evidence of gatherings where instruction, deliberation, or arbitration might have occurred. The cool echo imagined within these reconstructed internal spaces evokes the environment in which oral specialists honed their skills and transmitted their teachings. Their presence became essential to the management of alliances, the regulation of trade, and the maintenance of customary law, embedding the intellectual tradition into the daily mechanisms of governance. The intellectual traditions of this period also become visible through the standardized legal customs inferred from archaeological and ethnographic comparison across Britain and Gaul. Although the Celts did not record their laws in writing, the remarkable consistency of certain social practices, inheritance customs, oath-taking rituals, and dispute resolution ceremonies suggests the presence of an authoritative class trained in maintaining legal memory. Excavations at tribal centers, such as Bibracte, reveal assembly spaces where large groups could gather, indicated by terraced areas and wide, compacted platforms created through repeated use. The density of trampling in these zones, reconstructed through soil micromorphology, implies that they regularly hosted public hearings or ritual proceedings. In such contexts, proto-Druids likely recited precedents, resolved conflicts, and legitimized agreements through formulaic oral declarations. The imagined cadence of their speech, preserved only in the spatial organization of these sites, evokes the disciplined rhythm required to maintain legal codes without writing. Over generations, the intellectual rigor demanded by these practices elevated the Druidic class from ritual officiants to arbiters of societal order, positioning memory at the center of governance. The philosophical foundations of Druidic teaching also deepened during this period, even though no direct textual sources survive from the Druids themselves. Classical authors writing centuries later, Caesar, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus, consistently describe Druids as philosophers concerned with cosmology, ethics, and the nature of the soul. While these accounts must be read critically, archaeological parallels support the existence of a reflective intellectual tradition. At sanctuaries in the Champagne region, carved wooden posts and decorated stone fragments feature complex curvilinear motifs reminiscent of cosmological diagrams. The faint grooves worn into these surfaces, still visible despite centuries of erosion, suggest that they served as visual anchors for oral teaching. These motifs, combined with evidence of ceremonial cycles tied to solstice and equinox events, indicate a worldview in which natural rhythms shaped ethical and philosophical instruction. Knowledge specialists used these structured cycles to teach lessons about continuity, balance, and lineage, embedding philosophical meaning into the observable environment. Their ability to connect cosmic patterns with social obligations strengthened their roles as guides in both ritual and moral domains. The rise of Celtic linguistic cohesion further enabled the spread of these teachings. Linguistic reconstruction shows that by the 5th century BC, Celtic dialects across Britain, Gaul, and parts of Central Europe shared enough core vocabulary and grammatical features to support the transmission of complex oral traditions. This linguistic unity is mirrored in material culture, particularly in the widespread appearance of stylistically similar metalwork from the Latine horizon. Excavations at Latine itself reveal meticulously crafted scabbards, fibulae, and torques decorated with abstract motifs whose stylistic uniformity indicates shared symbolic systems. The fine incisions on these objects, preserved even where corrosion has darkened the metal, offer tactile evidence of artisanship linked to broader intellectual networks. These artifacts likely accompanied recitations of genealogies, mythic narratives, and ritual instruction, serving as visual cues that reinforced memory. The integration of language, art, and ritual into a single cultural system ensured that Druidic teachings could be transmitted across vast distances without written scripts, stabilizing identity across tribal boundaries. Feasting and seasonal ceremonies continued to serve as critical venues for reinforcing oral tradition. Archaeological assemblages from feasting complexes in both Britain and Gaul show patterns of consumption that align with structured gathering events. Large deposits of slaughtered animals, high-status ceramics, and imported goods suggest ritualized hospitality linked to elite competition and communal solidarity. The smoky aroma of hearth ash preserved on pottery fragments provides a faint sensory echo of these gatherings, where oral specialists likely recited epics, instructed initiates, and performed cosmological narratives before assembled audiences. These performances transformed knowledge into spectacle, embedding memory within communal experience. Over time, such gatherings created predictability in the rhythm of cultural life, anchoring tradition to seasonal cycles and reinforcing the authority of those who mastered the oral canon. Between 500 and 300 BC, the capacity to organize, preserve, and transmit complex bodies of knowledge became a defining feature of Celtic intellectual life. Ritual specialists evolved into disciplined scholars of oral tradition, individuals whose mastery of law, genealogy, cosmology, and ritual made them indispensable in maintaining cultural cohesion. Archaeological continuity across ceremonial landscapes, persistent linguistic unity, and shared symbolic forms all point toward the emergence of a fully developed intellectual class capable of sustaining a sophisticated worldview without written instruction. Their influence shaped not only ritual life, but the structures of authority, diplomacy, and social organization that characterized Iron Age Britain and Gaul. With memory as their primary resource, these specialists forged a system of knowledge that would define Druidic identity in the centuries to come. As the oral tradition reached maturity between 500 and 300 BC, its influence began shaping not only internal governance, but the broader cultural identity of Celtic societies. Archaeological evidence reveals a growing integration of ritual, artistic expression, and social hierarchy, each element reinforcing the authority of those trained to preserve collective memory. At major oppida emerging toward the end of this period, such as Basel Gasfabric and Montbeuvre, spatial organization reflects a distinct separation between domestic quarters, craft zones, and ceremonial areas. The placement of these ritual spaces, often elevated or enclosed, suggests that gatherings for instruction or recitation occurred within controlled environments that heightened the solemnity of spoken knowledge. Soil compaction patterns in these zones indicate repeated congregation of large groups, implying structured events where initiates advanced through stages of learning. The imagined resonance of spoken words within these semi-enclosed spaces evokes a sensorial impression of an intellectual tradition anchored in rhythm, cadence, and communal participation. The durability of oral systems relied on more than memorization. It required conceptual frameworks that connected cosmology with social obligations, enabling memory to function as both archive and guide. Archaeological patterns across Britain and Gaul show that ritual calendars became increasingly standardized, with ceremonies tied to agricultural cycles visible in pollen signatures, animal bone deposition, and hearth ash layers. The structured recurrence of seasonal rites provided regular intervals for public recitation, oath renewal, and the transmission of legal and historical knowledge. Faint scent of charred hazel and oak, found in ceremonial hearths, suggests controlled burning events aligned with these cycles. Such consistency implies that proto-Druids and early Druids orchestrated the rhythm of communal life through an intricate combination of observation, memory, and interpretation. Their authority stemmed from their ability to integrate environmental cues, solstice light, river levels, migratory patterns, into narrative structures that explained continuity and guided action. The oral tradition also required mechanisms to maintain accuracy across generations. Ethnographic parallels with other non-literate intellectual cultures indicate that techniques such as alliteration, formulaic phrasing, spatial mnemonic devices, and ritualized repetition would have been used extensively. Archaeological evidence hints at these practices through the recurring structure of ceremonial sites. Groves maintained for centuries, circular enclosures rebuilt on identical footprints, and deliberate pathways linking ritual spaces all provided physical anchors for memory. The repetitive movement through these landscapes preserved in the alignment of paths and entrances, served as embodied memory, a way for initiates to internalize teachings through spatial experience. The cool shade of sacred groves, reconstructed from pollen maps, offers a sensory reminder of settings where teachings were intertwined with the natural world, reinforcing conceptual links between cosmic order and community law. As these intellectual structures expanded, their social consequences became increasingly visible. Burial patterns reflect a shift toward roles associated with knowledge and ritual rather than purely martial or domestic status. In both Britain and Gaul, certain grave from this period contain objects such as iron knives, bronze mirrors, or ceremonial staffs that hint at symbolic authority rather than battlefield prowess. Although these artifacts cannot be directly identified as Druidic regalia, their presence indicates emerging social categories centered on mediation, memory, and ritual expertise. The polished surfaces of mirrors recovered from such grave, still reflecting dim traces of light despite centuries of corrosion, evoke the symbolic introspection associated with teaching traditions. Their placement within high-status burials underscores the growing prestige of intellectual roles, suggesting that society increasingly valued those who carried the burden of cultural continuity. By 300 BC, the intellectual framework underlying Celtic society had solidified into a mature oral tradition capable of supporting complex governance, ritual systems, and intertribal alliances. The archaeological record reveals networks of sanctuaries, hill forts, groves, and ceremonial centers that formed an interconnected mental map used by specialists to preserve and transmit knowledge. The consistency of artistic motifs, the standardization of ceremonial architecture, and the continuity of seasonal rites all point toward a unified worldview maintained through disciplined oral instruction. These developments mark the fully formed substrate upon which the Druids of the classical world would operate. Their authority would soon extend across legal, ritual, and philosophical domains, shaping both the internal dynamics of Celtic communities and their interactions with emerging Mediterranean powers. As the Iron Age progressed, the landscape itself became a living archive of cultural memory. The relationship between people and place deepened, with sacred sites serving as both geographical and intellectual anchors. This integration of ritual geography with oral tradition prepared the foundation for the next phase of Druidic development, where knowledge and landscape would merge into a cohesive system of sacred authority. Between 600 and 100 BC, the landscapes of Britain and Gaul evolved into complex ritual geographies where natural features, ceremonial structures, and communal memory converged into a unified system of sacred meaning. Archaeological evidence reveals that the placement of ritual sites was neither random nor solely pragmatic. Instead, it reflected a cosmological framework in which rivers, groves, hilltops, and wetlands served as distinct nodes within a spiritual topography. Excavations along the Thames, Seine, and Somme reveal consistent patterns of deposition: spears, swords, cauldrons, and finely crafted ornaments placed deliberately in the water. The faint metallic scent released when these objects are recovered from anaerobic river sediments offers a sensory echo of ancient ceremonies performed at dawn or dusk along riverbanks. Radiocarbon analysis situates many of these deposits between the 6th and 3rd centuries BC, aligning them with the period during which Druidic authority was solidifying. These offerings reflect an understanding of rivers not merely as waterways, but as liminal spaces connecting human communities to ancestral or divine forces. Hilltops, by contrast, served as places of visibility, assembly, and ritual orientation. Archaeological surveys of hill forts such as Dinas Powys, Cadbury Castle, and Montlassois reveal that many were positioned with deliberate sightlines toward distant mountains, river junctions, or solstice horizons. Soil micromorphology shows repeated ceremonial burning in certain interior areas, suggesting activities beyond domestic use. On some elevated sites, the play of light across rampart lines at sunrise or sunset continues to reproduce alignments that ancient communities would have observed. These optical effects, reconstructed by archaeoastronomers, underline the role of hilltops as vantage points through which ritual specialists interpreted cosmic rhythms. Their authority depended on an ability to integrate these celestial cues into ceremonial calendars that governed agricultural cycles, warfare timing, and communal gatherings. The hilltop became both literal and conceptual elevation, an environment where knowledge and horizon converged. Sacred groves formed another essential component of this ritual geography. Pollen analysis from regions associated with later Druidic activity, Anglesey, Armorica, and Central Gaul, indicates zones of controlled woodland management where oak, yew, and hazel were selectively preserved. These groves show little evidence of farming disturbance, implying they were intentionally maintained as sanctified spaces. Excavation of boundary ditches around certain groves suggests controlled access, while soil stratigraphy reveals that fires used in these settings were intensively managed, producing thin layers of charcoal rather than large ash deposits. When excavators lift these darkened soil horizons, the faint aroma of ancient wood smoke lingers, offering a sensory reminder of gatherings held beneath dense canopies. Such groves served as classrooms, courts, and ceremonial stages where ritual specialists instructed initiates, delivered judgments, and mediated disputes. Their seclusion created environments where knowledge was transmitted through the interplay of voice, wind, and filtered light. Wetlands served yet another purpose within this cultural map. Excavations at sites like Llyn Cerrig Batch in Wales and Lartene in Switzerland reveal waterlogged deposits containing weapons, chariot fittings, chains, and musical instruments. These objects show deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. The preservation of wooden artifacts in these anaerobic conditions, shield facings, spear shafts, carved handles, provides rare insight into the craftsmanship associated with ritual offerings. The cool stillness of these bogs, reconstructed through sediment analysis, evokes settings where sound, light, and movement were absorbed by peat and water. Such places marked thresholds between the living world and an ancestral realm, spaces where ritual specialists mediated exchanges intended to restore balance or seek favor from unseen forces. Their authority emerged from mastery of rituals that linked community well-being with the ecological rhythms of wetlands. The distribution of these sacred landscapes across Britain and Gaul reveals a coherent pattern governed by principles that proto-Druidic authorities had developed during earlier centuries. The landscape became a mnemonic system, each sacred site functioning as a chapter in a geographical text known and interpreted by those trained in the oral tradition. Groves preserved philosophical teachings, hilltops encoded astronomical knowledge, rivers facilitated rites of passage and offering, wetlands hosted ceremonies of transition or thanksgiving. This spatial structuring of belief allowed communities to articulate identity not only through memory but through movement across land, reinforcing a cultural geography that coexisted with the physical one. By 400 BC, this ritual geography had become deeply embedded in the social and intellectual life of Celtic societies. The archaeological record shows that sacred sites were maintained with remarkable continuity, often rebuilt or renewed across generations. Their preservation reflects the centralized role of ritual specialists whose authority structured the relationship between people and place. As the next century unfolded, these landscapes would serve as the stage upon which the fully developed Druidic order emerged, shaping politics, law, and identity throughout Britain and Gaul. Across Britain and Gaul, evidence from the 4th and 3rd centuries BC demonstrates an intensification of ritual activity in landscapes that had already acquired deep cultural meaning. Excavations at river confluences, particularly where the Marne meets the Seine and where the Ouse joins the Humber, reveal thick layers of votive deposits spanning multiple generations. These layers contain weapons deliberately bent, wooden figurines carved with stylized faces, and cauldrons repaired repeatedly before final deposition. Metallurgical analysis shows that many of these objects were fully functional at the time of offering, indicating that the ritual act involved meaningful sacrifice rather than the disposal of damaged goods. As archaeologists lift these water-darkened artifacts from river sediments, the faint mineral scent surrounding them hints at centuries of submersion. Such offerings reflect a belief system in which rivers served as mediators of renewal, their currents carrying gifts to ancestral or divine realms. Ritual specialists oversaw these acts, ensuring the correct placement, orientation, and timing, functions aligned with the responsibilities of early Druids described in later classical accounts. Hilltop sanctuaries also grew more elaborate during this period. At sites such as the Glauberg in Germany, southern Britain's Barbary Castle, and the Oppida of central Gaul, archaeologists have uncovered remains of processional ways, sculpted stone guardians, and terraces designed to accommodate gatherings. While these features vary regionally, their underlying principles are consistent: elevation, visibility, and structured movement. Soil compaction along certain paths suggests repeated use during ceremonial events, perhaps seasonal festivals or assemblies for oath-taking. The view from these heights, reconstructed through landscape modeling, reveals sightlines aligned with key celestial events, including solstitial risings and lunar standstills. When clouds settle low on these ridgelines today, the shift in light creates a sensory effect that mirrors what Iron Age participants may have witnessed. Such settings required ritual authorities capable of interpreting celestial patterns and integrating them into social decision-making. Their interpretations shaped agricultural schedules, migration routes, and alliances, reinforcing the fusion of natural observation and cultural identity. Sacred groves deepened in significance as centers of instruction and governance. Pollen cores from Anglesey, Armorica, and the Ardennes show intentional protection of certain woodland patches, with centuries of uninterrupted oak and yew growth. These botanical signatures indicate long-term reverence for specific species, consistent with later textual references to Druidic associations with oak. Excavations in peripheral zones around these groves reveal small ditches or banks marking boundaries, suggesting controlled access maintained over generations. Within these spaces, archaeologists occasionally find shallow pits containing charcoal, bone fragments, or broken pottery, hinting at repeated ceremonial acts. When these soil layers are examined today, the lingering scent of charred wood evokes the intimate, secluded rituals that likely occurred beneath dense canopies. The grove's isolation fostered environments suitable for transmitting oral traditions, resolving disputes, or initiating students. These tasks required individuals trained not only in cosmology, but in the ethical and legal frameworks that defined community order. Over time, the grove became both school and court, an essential element of Druidic ritual geography. Wetland sites offer an additional dimension to this sacred landscape. The iconic discoveries from Llyn Cerrig Bach in Wales and La Tine in Switzerland demonstrate the scale and variety of ritual offerings. Iron chains, chariot fittings, shield bosses, trumpets, and spear shafts show signs of intentional deposition, often following ceremonial destruction. Wooden artifacts preserved in these anaerobic conditions, spear handles, shield facings, carved beams, provide rare insight into ritual craftsmanship otherwise lost. The cool stillness of peat bogs, reconstructed through sediment analysis, suggests environments where sound was muted and visibility low, reinforcing a sense of liminality. Such settings likely hosted rites intended to communicate with deities associated with water, fertility, or boundaries between worlds. The specialists who presided over these ceremonies managed transitions of status, season, or social obligation, embedding authority within landscapes that blurred the line between the living and the ancestral. Together, these sacred environments created a unified ritual geography that extended across tribal boundaries, shaping a shared Celtic worldview. Rivers carried offerings to unseen forces, hilltops linked communal life to the sky, groves sheltered instruction and adjudication, wetlands absorbed gifts intended for cycles of renewal. Archaeological continuity across these landscapes reveals that knowledge specialists, proto-Druids and early Druids, maintained these sites as interconnected components of a single cosmological system. Their mastery of ritual geography transformed the land itself into a repository of cultural memory, embedding authority in both place and practice. As Britain and Gaul moved toward increased urbanization and political consolidation in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, these sacred landscapes would evolve into arenas where ritual authority intersected with emerging forms of governance. The next developments would see Druids take on greater roles not only in ceremonial life, but in mediating law, diplomacy, and social power. By the 2nd century BC, the ritual geography of Britain and Gaul had become inseparable from political authority. Hill forts grew into proto-urban centers where ceremonial, economic, and legal activities overlapped within carefully organized spatial layouts. Excavations at major oppida such as Manching, Bibracte, and Stanwix reveal inner sanctuaries deliberately isolated from markets, smithing zones, and domestic quarters. The boundary ditches surrounding these sanctuaries, filled with charcoal, pottery, and occasional human remains, signal controlled ceremonial access. When archaeologists cut into these layers, the scent of ancient ash drifts upward, a remnant of repeated rites that once framed community identity. These inner sanctuaries often served as platforms for decision-making, treaty ratification, or public recitation. Their placement at the heart of emerging urban landscapes shows how ritual specialists had become indispensable to governance. The Druids, inheritors of this system, used these spaces as courts and forums where law, memory, and tradition converged. The alignment of sacred sites with expanding trade routes further strengthened their function within social organization. Pathways connecting river valleys to highland settlements often passed through ritual zones, ensuring that travelers, traders, and delegates encountered ceremonial markers as they moved through the landscape. Trackways identified across southern Britain and central France show compacted layers where repeated movement created durable paths. Along these routes, archaeologists have identified concentrations of ritual deposits, broken weapons, animal bones, or crafted ornaments placed at natural thresholds such as springs, fords, or hill passes. The glint of water in these transitional spaces, still visible today, conveys how such sites embodied moments of passage. Ritual specialists likely oversaw offerings meant to secure safe travel or affirm obligations between communities. Their involvement reinforced the concept that movement across territory was also movement through the cosmological order, each step accompanied by memory, obligation, and oversight. Sacred groves, meanwhile, expanded their roles beyond instruction into arbitration and legal adjudication. Classical authors later described Druids presiding over disputes and issuing authoritative judgments, and the archaeological record hints at long-standing precedents. Surrounding some groves, excavations reveal small, open areas with repeated soil compaction patterns distinct from those left by large gatherings. These spaces likely served as councils where smaller groups met to resolve conflicts under ritual supervision. The filtered light falling through ancient canopies, reconstructed from pollen signatures, evokes an atmosphere suitable for solemn deliberation. Within such groves, ritual specialists integrated oral law with cosmological teaching, delivering judgments that reinforced social stability. Their authority rested on the perception that knowledge, tradition, and sacred landscape were inseparable. Each grove functioned as a living archive where memory was inscribed not on stone or parchment, but in repeated practice and spoken word. Wetlands continued to mark the thresholds where social, ecological, and spiritual boundaries met. The deposition of high-status objects in bogs intensified during the Late Iron Age, suggesting ceremonies tied to political transitions or responses to external pressures. At Lartine, wooden causeways constructed above marshy ground indicate processional architecture leading participants toward offering sites. The damp air rising from preserved planks during excavation evokes a sensory impression of ritual movement through suspended pathways. Such settings offered spaces where communities expressed collective fear, hope, or thanksgiving, guided by specialists who interpreted these emotions within broader cosmological narratives. As groups faced threats from expanding Roman influence or intertribal conflict, wetlands became places where ritual reaffirmed identity and continuity in the face of uncertainty. By 100 BC, the ritual geography of Britain and Gaul had evolved into a coherent ideological framework sustained by the authority of Druids. The landscape functioned as a mnemonic system in which rivers signaled renewal, groves embodied instruction, hilltops mediated between earth and sky, and wetlands hosted rites of transition. The archaeological record shows remarkable continuity in these practices, suggesting a shared cosmological order maintained across centuries by those trained in oral tradition. Their mastery of this geography positioned Druids as custodians of identity and interpreters of sacred space. Yet as the 1st century BC approached, these landscapes became theaters of growing political tension. Trade networks expanded, alliances shifted, and external powers, most notably Rome, began to exert influence along the fringes of Gaul. The intersection of ritual geography and political authority would soon propel the Druids into central roles in diplomacy, arbitration, and intertribal governance. Between 400 and 100 BC, the Druids moved decisively into the sphere of governance, shaping legal frameworks, diplomatic relations, and the rhythms of intertribal life across Britain and Gaul. Archaeological evidence from major oppida, Bibracte, Titelberg, and Stanwick reveals an organizational shift towards centralized political structures that required stable systems of arbitration. Within these fortified settlements, certain internal enclosures display repeated soil compaction, suggesting zones where assemblies convened at regular intervals. The density of trampling, preserved in thin microlayers, hints at large gatherings where disputes were settled, agreements ratified, and judgments delivered. The muted echo imagined within these enclosed spaces evokes a formal environment in which Druids acted as custodians of customary law. Their authority derived from mastery of oral legal codes preserved across generations, enabling them to mediate conflicts that might otherwise destabilize alliances. Material remains further reveal the integration of Druids into diplomatic processes. At Bibracte, feasting halls uncovered through excavation contain concentrations of high-status ceramics, amphorae fragments, and animal bones that indicate gatherings of political elites. The aroma of ancient wine, absorbed into imported amphora sherds, provides a faint sensory reminder of negotiations conducted over shared meals. Such feasts often accompanied treaty formation or alliance renewal, and classical authors later describe Druids presiding over deliberations to ensure adherence to tradition. Their presence legitimized agreements by linking communal decisions to ancestral law. This role was reinforced by the repeated placement of ritual deposits, broken weapons, decorated talks, or crafted offerings in nearby sanctuaries. These deposits served as ceremonial anchors for political decisions, binding alliances through sacred obligation rather than mere verbal assent. The knowledge specialists who supervised these rites provided the intellectual framework that stabilized political relations in societies without written treaties. The legal authority of Druids also becomes visible through patterns of burial, particularly those associated with individuals interred with items symbolizing status rooted in knowledge rather than warfare. In both Britain and Gaul, graves from the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC occasionally contain bronze mirrors, iron knives with symbolic markings, and wooden staffs preserved in waterlogged soils. The reflective surfaces of these mirrors, still capable of catching dim light despite corrosion, evoke associations with introspection, wisdom, and ritual authority. Their placement suggests that these individuals embodied roles centered on arbitration and counsel. Radiocarbon analysis of these burials situates them within phases of increasing political complexity, implying that the intellectual class expanded alongside the administrative needs of growing oppida. The integration of legal judgment, ritual sanction, and communal memory into a single role reflects the maturation of a distinctly Druidic identity. Archaeological patterns of movement reinforce this picture of Druids as mediators between tribes. Trackways connecting major settlements show evidence of repeated long-distance travel, visible in compacted soil layers and wear marks on natural stone surfaces. Along these routes, clusters of small ritual deposits, animal bones, broken brooches, or miniature weapons suggest that travelers paused at designated spots to perform offerings. These acts indicate that movement across territory was framed within a framework of ritual obligation. The specialists who managed these rites ensured that intertribal interactions occurred within stable cosmological boundaries. Their authority extended beyond domestic governance into the realm of regional diplomacy. This mobility helped establish a trans-regional intellectual network through which Druids maintained consistency in law, ritual, and teaching across vast areas of Britain and Gaul. Feasting continued to serve as an important stage for legal and political negotiation. Excavations from sites such as Alnat and Mont Bouvray reveal large communal hearths where repeated burning episodes created thick charcoal layers. When these layers are exposed during excavation, the lingering scent of ancient smoke provides a sensory clue to gatherings where judgments were issued and agreements reaffirmed. These events created opportunities for Druids to recite law publicly, preserving accuracy through ritual repetition and communal oversight. The public nature of these recitations reinforced accountability, binding leaders to decisions through both social expectation and sacred sanction. Such structures of memory functioned as unwritten constitutions governing intertribal relations. As the political landscape of Britain and Gaul became more interconnected, the legal and diplomatic authority of the Druids expanded in scope and consequence. Archaeological evidence from Oppida across central France and southern Britain reveals intentional urban planning that accommodated assemblies, judicial gatherings, and ritual proceedings. At Corinth in the Auvergne region, excavations have uncovered a large open plaza bordered by structures containing drinking vessels, ceremonial pottery, and feasting debris. Soil micromorphology shows compacted layers indicating repeated congregation. The faint mineral scent, released from the plaza's surfaces during excavation, captures the sensory residue of countless deliberations. Such spaces were not merely markets or communal courtyards. They were arenas of governance where Druids exercised interpretive authority over law and custom. Their judgments were accepted not because they enforced them through power, but because they embodied the continuity of tradition supported by centuries of oral transmission. The role of Druids in regulating warfare becomes increasingly evident during this period. Although they did not fight, their influence extended to the moral and ritual parameters surrounding conflict. Excavations at sanctuaries associated with warrior cults, such as the sites of Gournay-sur-Aronde and Riedmont-sur-Anca, show structured deposits of weapons, shields, and armor following formal destruction. Metallurgical analysis of these objects reveals a consistent pattern. Blades bent deliberately, shield bosses struck precisely at the center, spearheads blunted before burial. These actions suggest ritual disarmament performed under the supervision of specialists who sought to contain violence within culturally sanctioned boundaries. When archaeologists lift such items from the soil, the cold, dense weight of twisted iron evokes the solemnity of ceremonies intended to transform instruments of violence into symbols of restored order. The proto-judicial functions performed at these sanctuaries reinforce the idea that Druids mediated transitions between war and peace, ensuring that conflict never severed the continuity of law. Intertribal diplomacy also relied heavily on the intellectual authority of Druids. Trade in salt, metals, textiles, and livestock increased significantly between the 4th and 2nd centuries BC, linking distant regions through complex economic systems. Archaeological surveys show that many trade routes converged at ritualized border zones, springs, river crossings, or forest edges, where offerings were placed in shallow pits or small enclosures. These deposits often include ceramic vessels broken deliberately, animal bones arranged in patterns, or personal ornaments left behind as markers of safe passage. The quiet trickle of water in spring sites excavated today evokes the atmosphere of negotiation in which Druids likely oversaw the exchange of goods and the resolution of competing claims. Their presence at these liminal zones ensured that transactions occurred within frameworks of trust shaped by shared cosmology. Over time, Druids became indispensable intermediaries in matters that crossed territorial boundaries, strengthening their influence across different Celtic polities. Equally significant was the role Druids played in preserving intergenerational continuity during periods of social transition. In regions undergoing rapid consolidation, such as the Oppida zones of the Upper Rhine, the Marne, and eastern England, burial practices shifted to emphasize ritual authority rather than martial prestige. Graves occasionally contain objects associated with symbolic knowledge: bronze mirrors with finely polished surfaces, knives bearing spiral engravings, or beads arranged in sequences that may reflect mnemonic devices. The reflective quality of these mirrors, even when dulled by time, suggests associations with introspection or divination. Such burials imply the elevation of individuals whose status derived from intellectual and ritual mastery. Radiocarbon analysis situates these graves within the same period when urban centers were flourishing, hinting at the rising social value placed on those who mediated lore and memory. As communities became more socially stratified, the interpretive skills of Druids formed the connective tissue linking different classes, professions, and tribes. Their ability to articulate customary lore, trace genealogies, and interpret omens allowed them to maintain cohesion across diverse groups. Classical authors later remarked on the Druids' role as judges, but the archaeological record shows that this function was centuries in the making. Their authority rested not on coercion, but on reputation, expertise, and the shared belief that they safeguarded the equilibrium between human society and the natural order. In this phase, Druids emerged not only as ritual specialists, but as foundational figures in political culture. By the close of the 2nd century BC, the Druids' influence had become essential to the functioning of Celtic society. Their judgments shaped alliances, their rituals guided diplomacy, and their memory preserved continuity through generations. Yet these same qualities would soon position them at the forefront of resistance as external powers, most notably Rome, began to threaten the autonomy of tribal confederations. By the early 1st century BC, the political authority of the Druids reached its most structured and visible form, coinciding with the rise of large oppida that operated as regional capitals. Excavations at Manching, Bibracte, and Avaricum reveal administrative districts distinguished by spacious courtyards, storage complexes, and ritual enclosures positioned with deliberate separation from domestic quarters. These spatial arrangements mirror the dual roles Druids held, mediators of law and custodians of sacred tradition. Soil micromorphology in these areas shows repeated gatherings that press surfaces into firm, flattened layers, implying decades of assemblies where judgments were issued and disputes settled. The muted acoustics reconstructed for these courtyard spaces evoke a setting where ritualized speech carried weight, anchoring political decisions within a framework of customary law. Druids presided not through force, but through recognition of their mastery over memory, precedent, and cosmological meaning. In the same period, diplomatic rituals involving the exchange of prestige goods became central to intertribal relations, with Druids serving as authoritative witnesses. Finds of imported amphorae, bronze cauldrons, and elaborately decorated talks in elite compounds indicate that feasting and gift-giving were mechanisms for negotiating alliances. Residue analysis on amphora fragments from sites in the Seine and Marne regions reveals traces of Mediterranean wine infused with herbs, suggesting ceremonial consumption during treaty gatherings. The faint aroma released during laboratory analysis provides a sensory connection to these events, where Druids likely recited genealogies and invoked ancestral precedent to legitimize agreements. Their presence elevated political negotiations into sacred acts, binding leaders to their promises through cosmology and memory. In societies without written treaties, Druids became living archives whose recitations held legal enforceability. This role solidified their influence as indispensable arbiters across tribal boundaries. The rise of large funerary monuments during this period provides further insight into how the intellectual class shaped social order. In Gaul, richly equipped burials such as the Princess, Grave at Vix, or Woldelsgesheim, though primarily elite in character, contain symbolic objects that hint at ritual authority embedded within aristocratic identity. Mirrors, carved wooden boxes, and ceremonial drinking vessels suggest a fusion of political and ritual functions. The polished surfaces of these mirrors capture dim reflections even now, offering sensory evidence of their use in rites involving introspection or divinatory symbolism. While not definitively linked to Druids, the presence of such items in elite contexts underscores the prestige associated with intellectual and ritual mastery. These grave goods, when considered alongside evidence of ceremonial feasting and ritual deposition, point to societies in which knowledge, lineage, and authority were tightly interwoven. The judicial power of Druids becomes even more pronounced in regions that experienced heightened intertribal conflict. Excavations at sanctuaries such as Gurney-sur-Aronde show phases of ritual closure and reopening consistent with periods of war and reconciliation. Layers containing deliberately broken weapons, arranged in patterned deposits, suggest ceremonies marking the end of conflict or the restoration of order. The heavy, cold iron of these twisted blades, pulled from waterlogged pits during excavation, conveys the solemnity of these rites. Druids likely oversaw such transitions, transforming violence into regulated memory through ritual destruction of arms. These practices reinforced the idea that warfare, though central to elite identity, remained subordinate to the cosmological and legal principles preserved by intellectual authorities. As Roman influence expanded along the Mediterranean frontier, tribal confederations in Gaul began to reorganize politically, forming alliances and coalitions to manage external pressures. Archaeological evidence from Oppida shows increased storage capacity, fortified defenses, and intensified craft production, signs of growing administrative complexity. In this shifting landscape, Druids assumed even greater importance as stabilizing figures capable of mediating alliances, interpreting omens, and ensuring continuity through rapidly changing conditions. Their authority operated across tribal boundaries, creating a pan-regional network that preserved cultural coherence even as political fragmentation increased. By 100 BC, the Druids of Britain and Gaul had become central to the functioning of Celtic society. Their mastery of legal codes, ritual knowledge, and cosmological interpretation allowed them to govern the moral and political life of communities without the need for written statutes. This system, rooted in centuries of oral tradition and ritual geography, reached its fullest expression just as Rome prepared to impose its own administrative and ideological structures on the western fringes of Europe. The encounter between these two systems, oral, sacred, and place-based on one hand, written, imperial, and expansionist on the other, would define the next stage of Druidic history. As Roman armies advanced, Druids would assume new roles as guardians of cultural identity and orchestrators of ritualized resistance. Between 350 BC, the martial landscape of Britain and Gaul underwent a transformation marked by intensified intertribal conflict, fortified settlement expansion, and increasing encounters with Mediterranean powers. Within this dynamic environment, the Druids assumed a critical role in shaping the psychology of warfare, instilling ethical frameworks, ritual discipline, and cosmological interpretation in the warrior class. Archaeological evidence from Latine phase battle sites, including those near the Aisne Valley and Lake Neuchatel, reveals structured deposition of armor and weaponry following combat. Many weapons show signs of deliberate alteration, spearheads bent, sword blades twisted, shield bosses crushed, indicating ritual destruction rather than random damage. The cold weight of these distorted iron pieces, lifted carefully from layered sediments, conveys the solemnity of ceremonies supervised by specialists who mediated transitions from violence to restored harmony. These rituals reflect the Druidic conviction that warfare existed within a moral and cosmological order, requiring guidance from those trained to interpret its consequences. The accounts of classical observers, although shaped by external perspective, provide additional context that aligns with archaeological evidence. Caesar, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus described Druids as individuals who taught doctrines concerning the soul, the afterlife, and cycles of reincarnation. These teachings, transmitted orally through rigorous training, likely shaped the attitudes of warriors toward death and courage. Excavations at sanctuaries associated with warrior cults, such as Gurney-sur-Aronde, support the idea that combat held ritual significance. The presence of deliberately displayed human remains, arranged along post holes or suspended from gateways, suggests that the battlefield extended into ceremonial space. When archaeologists uncover these remains, the juxtaposition of bone against weathered soil evokes the intersection of ritual and violence inherent in Iron Age martial culture. Druids, acting as interpreters of cosmic continuity, provided warriors with conceptual structures that transformed fear into duty and mortality into transition rather than end. Material culture from this period further illuminates the intellectual frameworks that accompanied warfare. The intricately decorated scabbards, torques, and shields recovered from Latin sites bear motifs that communicate themes of transformation, fluidity, and cyclical order. The smooth curvature of spiral engravings, still visible despite centuries of patination, reveals symbolic vocabulary aligned with Druidic cosmology. Such motifs likely served not only as artistic expression, but as didactic tools used in instruction. Warriors trained within this system would have understood their role as part of a broader continuum linking ancestors, natural forces, and the unfolding of time. This ideological foundation reinforced collective identity and provided psychological resilience, particularly during prolonged conflict. The presence of these artifacts in both domestic and ritual contexts suggests that martial ideology permeated everyday life, guided by teachings that bound courage to cosmological insight. The archaeological record also reveals ceremonial pre-battle rites designed to prepare warriors psychologically and spiritually. At multiple Latin sites, shallow circular pits containing animal bones, charred wood, and fragmentary weapons appear adjacent to defensive structures or hill fort entrances. Radiocarbon dating places many of these features in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, aligning them with documented increases in intertribal conflict. Soil micromorphology indicates repeated burning episodes, implying ritual feasts or sacrificial acts conducted before mobilization. The faint aroma of burnt bone released during excavation provides a sensory trace of gatherings where Druids likely invoked ancestral protection, issued omens, and recited mythic precedents to shape collective resolve. These ceremonies did more than sanctify combat. They embedded warfare within cyclical narratives that framed victory and defeat as part of an ordered universe. As intertribal rivalries intensified, Druids also served as mediators capable of intervening to prevent escalation. Classical accounts reference instances where Druids stepped between opposing armies, leveraging moral authority to halt battle. While these accounts are filtered through Roman interpretation, archaeological evidence supports the existence of diplomatic rituals embedded in martial contexts. At certain boundary zones, springs, forest edges, and river crossings, excavations have uncovered structured deposits suggesting negotiated offerings. These deposits include paired weapons, intentionally matched animal remains, or mirrored items placed on either side of natural boundaries. The quiet atmosphere reconstructed from these transitional landscapes evokes settings where peace was restored through ceremonial exchange. Druids overseeing such rites acted as custodians of equilibrium, ensuring that warfare did not fracture the social fabric or violate cosmological order. The training of warriors during this period also reflected a pedagogical system that fused discipline with cosmology. Although no written manuals survive, archaeological evidence suggests structured learning environments within hill forts and oppida. Excavations at fortified centers such as Danebury, Montbeuvray, and the Huneberg reveal open courtyards, fenced training grounds, and compacted practice areas where repeated movement etched patterns into the soil. These surfaces, hardened by generations of footwork, hint at physical drills that accompanied instruction in ritual and ethics. Within these spaces, Druids likely guided warriors through exercises meant to cultivate endurance, composure, and attentiveness to environmental cues. The quiet discipline reconstructed from these settings suggests training that combined martial technique with controlled breathing, rhythmic recitation, and mental visualization, methods consistent with oral cultures that emphasized internal strength and clarity of thought. Such practices would have reinforced the psychological resilience necessary for warriors expected to confront death with calm resolve. Material remains associated with warrior elites further illuminate the psychological dimension of Druidic instruction. Torques discovered in Grave across Britain and Gaul, crafted from twisted gold or bronze, often display symbolic motifs communicating themes of continuity, regeneration, and transformation. The tactile heft of these objects, cool to the touch, even in burial contexts, underscores their role as more than personal adornment. They served as physical reminders of teachings about lineage and cosmic order, grounding individual identity within broader cycles. Similarly, decorated scabbards recovered from lateen sites exhibit swirling patterns that create a sense of movement across the surface. These motifs, visible even after centuries of corrosion, may have functioned as meditative aids during ritual preparation. Such artifacts suggest an educational system in which objects reinforced oral teachings, guiding warriors toward a psychological state aligned with Druidic principles. Certain sanctuaries from this period indicate that Druids also supervised rites of passage that prepared young elites for leadership roles in warfare. Excavations at Gurney-sur-Arronde, Ribemont-sur-Anca, and similar sites reveal deposits of animal remains and ceremonial feasting debris associated with youth initiation. Stratified layers containing burnt food waste, broken drinking vessels, and fragmentary weapons suggest events structured around shared consumption, symbolic offerings, and communal recitation. The faint scent of charred grain released from these layers offers a sensory link to rites that mark the transition from adolescence to adulthood. These ceremonies likely involved instruction in courage, loyalty, and the responsibilities of warfare, delivered in poetic or formulaic language that linked individual development with ancestral precedent. Through such rites, Druids shaped not only warrior psychology, but the social hierarchies tied to martial success. The relationship between warriors and Druids was further reinforced by the presence of ritualized spaces on the peripheries of battlefields. Archaeological surveys near the Aisne and Marne valleys identify zones containing small shrines, shallow offering pits, and altars made from timber or stone. These features often align with routes leading into fortified settlements, suggesting that warriors passing through these thresholds engaged in preparatory rites. Offerings of broken brooches, small metal ornaments, or animal bones placed in these pits indicate acts of dedication or seeking favor. The quiet stillness reconstructed in these peripheral landscapes conveys an atmosphere of introspection before conflict, where Druids may have performed protective rituals or issued omens based on natural signs. Their interpretations provided psychological grounding, transforming uncertainty into structured expectation and aligning warriors with the perceived will of the cosmos. Ritual specialists also influenced the emotional aftermath of warfare. Evidence from post-battle sanctuaries shows structured deposition of trophies, shields, helmets, and armor following ceremonial destruction. These acts serve to reframe violence within a framework of cosmic renewal. The heavy clang of iron fragments during excavation evokes the solemnity of rituals that sought to cleanse the community of martial residue. Druids likely officiated these ceremonies to reaffirm communal identity, honor the dead, and restore balance after conflict. Through such practices, they ensured that warfare remained bounded by moral principles, preventing cycles of violence from destabilizing intertribal order. By the mid-1st century BC, Druidic authority over warfare, through teaching, ritual mediation, psychological discipline, and cosmological interpretation, had become deeply embedded in Celtic society. Their influence extended from the training grounds to the battlefield, from ritual thresholds to negotiations between tribes. Yet this authority, rooted in continuity and oral tradition, would soon confront an imperial system grounded in written law, centralized command, and strategic conquest. As Roman armies approached the frontiers of Gaul, the interplay between Druidic teaching and martial identity would shape the resistance that followed. The next stage of this narrative explores how Druids confronted the unprecedented challenge posed by Roman expansion. As the 1st century BC advanced, the widening shadow of Roman expansion transformed the psychological and strategic landscape in which Druids operated. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites near the Rhône, Garonne, and Upper Rhine shows sudden phases of defensive reconstruction, thickened ramparts, enlarged ditches, and hastily repaired palisades, reflecting growing anxieties across tribal confederations. These modifications, visible as sharply contrasting soil layers in excavation profiles, indicate responses to distant conflicts that had begun to ripple inward. Within these fortifications, traces of intensified metalworking, slag deposits, furnace pits, and rapidly produced weaponry reveal an accelerated militarization. The acrid smell of burned slag still rising from some contexts evokes an atmosphere of preparation, urgency, and communal strain. In this environment, Druids stepped into roles that combined ritual authority with strategic counsel, ensuring that warfare remained anchored within cosmological and ethical frameworks even as external pressures mounted. Classical accounts from this period, despite their biases, consistently portray Druids as influential advisors to chieftains confronting Rome. Caesar's descriptions, though crafted for political narrative, align with archaeological indicators of ritual activity integrated into military decision-making. Near major oppida such as Gergovia and Avaricum, excavations have revealed peripheral sanctuaries containing deposits made shortly before their destruction, animal bones, broken drinking vessels, and fragments of weaponry arranged in patterns consistent with pre-battle rites. The controlled burning layers in these shrines, visible as thin horizontal bands of charcoal, suggest ceremonies conducted to invoke ancestral protection or divine sanction. When these darkened soils release faint traces of ancient smoke during excavation, they provide a sensory reminder of emissaries and warriors seeking guidance before confronting an enemy equipped with siegecraft, metallurgy, and discipline unprecedented in Celtic experience. Druids, as interpreters of fate and custodians of ritual order, provided psychological frameworks that transformed fear into resolve, reinforcing cohesion in the face of imperial might. Evidence from diplomatic zones also reveals how Druids attempted to mediate crises before they reached catastrophic proportions. At river crossings along the Saône and Loire, archaeologists have identified structured deposits dating to the decades immediately preceding Caesar's campaigns. These offerings, paired spearheads, deliberately broken ornaments, and animal remains arranged with formal symmetry, suggest attempts to secure peace or stabilize alliances under extraordinary pressure. The quiet flow of these rivers today mirrors the liminal quality of such sites, where Druids likely interpreted omens, negotiated with emissaries, and sought to preserve equilibrium across increasingly fragile coalitions. These rituals emphasize that Druidic authority extended beyond spiritual consolation. It encompassed diplomatic strategy grounded in customary law and revered precedent. Their interventions aimed to maintain unity among tribes whose internal rivalries sometimes undermined collective defense. The psychological teachings of Druids grew even more significant as Rome approached. Excavations at sanctuaries associated with warrior cults show an uptick in ceremonial activity during the mid-1st century BC. The presence of newly deposited weapons, freshly broken or burned, indicates intensified rites focused on courage, sacrifice, and communal identity. These practices, integrated with long-standing teachings on the cyclical nature of the soul and the continuity between life and death, helped warriors confront a highly organized adversary. The cold gleam of iron fragments uncovered in these contexts, still sharp despite centuries underground, underscores the immediacy with which ritual was invoked to sustain morale. Druids framed warfare within a cosmological cycle that minimized fear by embedding mortality within patterns of return and renewal. This philosophical grounding became crucial as tribes prepared for conflicts that threatened not only political autonomy, but the very foundations of their cosmological order. Yet the same qualities that made Druids indispensable also made them targets as Rome advanced. Their control over memory, law, and ritual provided coherence to societies Rome sought to divide and conquer. Classical sources written during or after Caesar's campaigns consistently emphasize that Druids held authority capable of unifying tribes in resistance. Archaeological evidence suggests that they participated in strategic councils, interpreted omens before decisive battles, and offered counsel intended to align military action with cosmic order. Their roles had evolved over centuries, from mediators of ritual and law to anchors of political and psychological identity in an era of existential threat. By the final decades before Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the intellectual and spiritual system maintained by the Druids was both at its height and under imminent threat. The discipline, courage, and cosmological perspective they instilled in warriors shaped the resistance that followed, influencing both the character of conflict and the narratives preserved in later sources. As Rome approached the frontiers of Gaul and Britain, the confrontation between imperial expansion and Druidic authority became inevitable. This encounter ethnographic, political, and ideological, would determine not only the fate of the Druids, but the trajectory of Celtic civilization. Between 150 BC, the widening contact zone between Rome and the Celtic world produced the first sustained written descriptions of the Druids. These accounts, recorded by Greek and Roman observers, did not emerge from neutral inquiry, but from political, military, and ideological contexts that shaped how Celtic society was portrayed. Archaeological evidence reveals that during this period, trade intensified along the Rhône, Garonne, and Seine corridors, bringing Mediterranean goods into the heart of Gaul. Amphorae, finewares, and bronze vessels discovered in Oppida, such as Bibracte and Toulouse, indicate regular interaction with merchants who carried not only goods, but also stories. The faint aroma of resin absorbed into amphora sherds evokes the sensory world of these transaction zones, where cultural interpretation unfolded through exchange, curiosity, and misunderstanding. It was within this climate of increasing contact that outsiders first attempted to describe the Druids, often filtering observation through their own intellectual frameworks. The earliest known ethnographic references to Druids appear in the writings of Posidonius, a Greek philosopher who traveled through Gaul in the late 2nd or early 1st century BC. Although his original texts are lost, fragments preserved by later authors suggest that he observed a society governed by ritual specialists who played roles in law, philosophy, and sacrifice. Archaeological data corroborates aspects of his descriptions. Sanctuaries in southern Gaul display evidence of ceremonial activity involving animal and possibly human sacrifice, visible in patterned bone deposits and cut marks consistent with ritual procedures. At sites such as Gournay-sur-Aronde, the placement of human remains alongside weapons and animal offerings hints at ceremonial contexts that might have appeared alien or unsettling to Mediterranean observers. When archaeologists examine these bone assemblages today, the juxtaposition of human and animal remains under thin layers of charcoal evokes a sensory impression of rites that were easily misinterpreted by outsiders unfamiliar with Celtic cosmology. Posidonius's observations, filtered through Stoic philosophy, laid the foundation for later portrayals that blended description with moral commentary. Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, written during and after his campaigns in Gaul, remains the most influential classical source on the Druids. Yet his ethnographic sections must be read alongside archaeological evidence and political intent. Caesar emphasized the Druids' role in education, law, and cosmology, portraying them as philosophers who taught doctrines concerning the soul and the universe. These statements align with the intellectual functions evidenced through centuries of ritual continuity. However, he also highlighted practices such as human sacrifice, presenting them as markers of barbarism that justified Roman intervention. Archaeological evidence reveals that while ritual killing did occur in certain contexts, its scale and purpose differed from Caesar's dramatic portrayals. The discovery of bog bodies in northern Europe, including the preserved remains at Toland and Grorbel, though outside Gaul itself, demonstrates ritual death associated with cosmological cycles rather than indiscriminate violence. The cold, preserved texture of peat-soaked skin evokes ceremonies linked to kingship, fertility, or boundary renewal, not mass sacrifice. Caesar's narrative, written to legitimize conquest, exaggerated these elements while obscuring the intellectual sophistication that underpinned Druidic authority. Roman authors also misinterpreted the Druidic refusal to commit sacred knowledge to writing. Archaeological and linguistic evidence shows that Celtic societies had access to writing systems during this period: Greek script in southern Gaul, Latin script in border regions, and early Celtic inscriptions along trade corridors. Yet Druids preserved their teachings orally. Classical authors understood this choice as resistance to learning or lack of literacy. In reality, the refusal reflected an intellectual principle rooted in memory, interpretation, and the belief that wisdom was inseparable from voice and ritual context. The smooth surfaces of inscribed pottery shards and imported tablets excavated from Gaulish settlements reveal that writing was known but intentionally limited. This selective literacy underlines a system where oral transmission safeguarded flexibility, prevented misinterpretation, and embedded knowledge in communal participation rather than isolated text. Roman observers, shaped by their own written tradition, interpreted this as primitivism rather than philosophical design. As contact deepened, Roman ethnographers projected their own categories onto Celtic society. They compared Druids to philosophers, bards to poets, and warriors to Homeric heroes, shaping narratives that fit familiar intellectual molds. Yet archaeological evidence underscores that Celtic ritual, law, and cosmology operated within frameworks distinct from Greco-Roman traditions. The rhythmic patterns of deposition in sanctuaries, the alignment of ceremonial sites with celestial cycles, and the deep integration of landscape and memory reveal a worldview resistant to easy translation. Roman interpretations, preserved in surviving texts, therefore reflect a mixture of admiration, confusion, and imperial ambition. The sensory realities of ritual, smoke rising through groves, light slicing across hilltop sanctuaries, the cold surface of iron offered to river currents, rarely survive in literary accounts, yet they formed the lived context of Druidic practice. By 60 BC, the encounter between Rome and the Druids had moved beyond mutual observation into active political tension. Roman expansion threatened not only Celtic autonomy, but the intellectual, legal, and ritual systems sustained by the Druidic order. The next phase would bring conflict that tested the authority of Druids and reshaped the cultural landscape of Gaul. As Roman influence pressed deeper into Gaul during the 1st century BC, the interpretive gap between Celtic self-understanding and Roman ethnography widened. Archaeological evidence from Rhone Valley settlements shows increasing quantities of imported pottery, wine amphorae, and metalware, reflecting both economic integration and cultural tension. These objects, excavated from refuse pits and elite compounds, carry faint residues of resin and pitch that evoke the sensory world of Gaulish elites navigating new tastes, new technologies, and new political realities. Yet despite these exchanges, the intellectual autonomy of the Druids remained intact. Their teachings, preserved through oral tradition and enacted within sacred landscapes, resisted assimilation into the Roman framework. This resistance, rooted in centuries of ritual authority and communal trust, made them both essential and threatening in Roman eyes. Classical writers often conflated Druidic secrecy with political subversion, interpreting philosophical reserve as evidence of conspiracy. Their misunderstandings reflected not only cultural distance, but strategic rhetoric aimed at weakening indigenous authority. The Roman tendency to exoticize the Druids becomes particularly evident in accounts that emphasized ritual severity or unusual practices. Strabo, writing from a distance and relying on earlier sources, described Druids as philosophers who combined natural science with ethical instruction, yet he also repeated tales of human sacrifice that blended observation with exaggeration. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries across Gaul and Britain indicates that while sacrificial rituals did occur, they were neither ubiquitous nor indiscriminate. Sites such as Gurney-sur-Aron display remains arranged with deliberate precision, animal bones grouped by species, weapons positioned symmetrically, reflecting structured rites rather than chaotic violence. The faint soot layers found on ceremonial pits, released as a dusty aroma during excavation, suggest repeated but controlled burning events aligned with seasonal cycles. Roman authors, unfamiliar with the cosmological context of these rites, interpreted them through moralistic lenses, emphasizing shock over structure. Their narratives often served to contrast Roman civilization with Celtic barbarism, creating ideological justification for conquest. Despite these distortions, Roman accounts also preserve valuable insights into Druidic intellectual life. Caesar's remark that Druids studied the stars, the movements of the heavens, the nature of the world, and the power of the gods aligns closely with evidence from ceremonial landscapes across Britain and Gaul. The alignment of hilltop sanctuaries with solstice and equinox horizons, the placement of offerings in river confluences associated with celestial symbols, and the preservation of sacred groves maintained for centuries all suggest a cosmology deeply tied to natural cycles. When archaeologists reconstruct sightlines from these hilltops, the slow shift of light across ridgelines at dawn evokes the sensory world in which omens were read, calendars set, and philosophical teachings delivered. Roman writers acknowledged this intellectual sophistication, even as political narratives pushed them to depict Druids as obstacles to imperial rule. The Romans also misunderstood the social function of the Druidic refusal to write down sacred teachings. While literacy existed in Gaul, evidenced by Greek and Latin inscriptions on pottery, coins, and imported goods, Druids preserved their doctrines through memorization. Roman authors interpreted this as refusal to advance or unwillingness to learn. Archaeological evidence contradicts such assumptions. In southern Gaul, inscriptions in Greek script appear in commercial contexts, indicating that writing was known and used when appropriate. The selective nature of literacy suggests intentional boundaries rather than ignorance. Sacred knowledge transmitted through voice maintained flexibility, preserved nuance, and ensured that teaching remained embedded in communal performance rather than fixed text. The smooth surfaces of imported tablets and inscribed sherds unearthed from Gaulish middens reveal a society familiar with writing, but committed to a philosophical system grounded in memory. As Rome prepared for conquest, its ethnographers increasingly portrayed Druids as political actors rather than purely ritual specialists. Caesar claimed that Druids met annually in central Gaul, a detail that, though unverified archaeologically, may reflect the mobility and networked influence of the intellectual class. Patterns of ritual sites across central France suggest interconnected ceremonial centers that could have supported periodic gatherings. Soil compaction patterns, identical architectural features, and parallel deposition sequences hint at a shared system of practice maintained across distance. Such networks allowed Druids to function as mediators in disputes involving multiple tribes, a role that posed significant challenge to Roman aims of divide and rule governance. Consequently, classical authors emphasized Druidic authority in ways that underscored the strategic rationale for suppressing them. By the late 50s BC, Roman perceptions of the Druids had solidified into a mixture of fascination, respect, and hostility. Archaeological evidence, burned sanctuaries, abruptly abandoned groves, and disrupted ritual deposition suggests that the final years before Caesar's conquest witnessed heightened anxiety across Gaul. Ritual specialists, long at the center of legal and cosmological authority, now stood positioned against an empire determined to reshape the political landscape. By the late 50s BC, the widening gulf between Roman representation and Celtic self-understanding had reached a point where ethnography merged seamlessly with strategy. Archaeological evidence across Gaul reveals a period of rapid disruption, which begins several years before Caesar's armies fully enter the region. At major oppida such as Bibracte, Gergovia, and Avaricum, layers of destruction, burned ramparts, collapsed buildings, and abruptly abandoned workshops suggest heightened political tension and localized conflicts preceding Roman intervention. Charcoal-rich deposits from these destruction layers, when exposed during excavation, release the faint scent of burnt oak and fir, echoing moments of crisis that reshaped the cultural landscape even before legions arrived. Within this atmosphere of instability, Druids assumed increasingly visible roles as advisors, arbitrators, and guardians of ritual cohesion, their authority invoked to maintain unity across tribes facing unprecedented external threat. Roman accounts portray these years as a time of internal disorder among the Gauls, but archaeological patterns suggest coordinated, albeit strained, efforts to maintain alliances. Trackways connecting major settlements show intensified movement, visible in deepened ruts and widened paths that indicate rapid travel by emissaries. In several transitional landscapes, springs, river crossings, and border groves, archaeologists have uncovered ritual deposits dating precisely to the mid-1st century BC. These offerings, including deliberately broken brooches, paired spearheads, and carefully placed animal remains, point to ceremonies intended to reaffirm shared obligations. The quiet trickle of water at these sites today evokes the solemn atmosphere in which Druids likely presided over diplomatic attempts to stabilize intertribal relations. These acts reflect not disunity, but a concerted effort to preserve a ritual and political order under mounting pressure. Yet Roman interpretations often reframed such acts of cohesion as signs of conspiracy. Caesar's narratives describe councils, alliances, and collective decisions as threatening forms of unity that needed to be dismantled for the sake of imperial security. Archaeologically, however, the patterns he identifies correspond to long-standing practices of intertribal governance mediated by Druids. Central sanctuaries in the regions of the Loire and Seine show evidence of gatherings involving large groups during these decades, ceramic concentrations, large communal hearths, and expansive trampled surfaces. The residue of wine and local fermented beverages found on pottery fragments suggests shared feasting, while layers of ash and charcoal indicate repeated ceremonial burning. These gatherings reflect a ritual calendar maintained through centuries of Druidic oversight rather than sudden political collusion. The sensory weight of these burnt layers, rich with the smell of ancient wood smoke, captures the continuity of ceremonial life that Roman observers often misinterpreted. Caesar's depictions of Druidic power served a political purpose. By portraying Druids as instigators of resistance and overseers of human sacrifice, he justified their suppression as both moral necessity and strategic imperative. Yet archaeological evidence paints a more nuanced picture. Ritual deposits from this period show continuity rather than escalation of sacrificial practices. Human remains found in sanctuaries appear in contexts consistent with earlier centuries. Symbolic positions, patterned arrangements, and controlled burning, indicating rites embedded within cosmological cycles rather than wartime desperation. The cool, peat-saturated surfaces that preserve some of these remains, when uncovered, carry a sensory stillness that underscores their ritual nature. Roman texts amplified these practices to contrast Celtic barbarism with Roman order, obscuring the intellectual and ceremonial functions Druids performed within their societies. Nevertheless, Rome correctly identified Druids as a source of cohesion. Their influence crossed territorial boundaries, linking tribes through shared ritual, legal, and philosophical frameworks. They preserved cosmological meaning, mediated disputes, and anchored identity in landscapes that Rome sought to reorganize into provinces. Archaeological evidence from Oppida, destroyed or forcibly reorganized during Caesar's campaigns, shows abrupt termination of long-standing ritual activity, groves cut, sanctuaries burned, and wetland deposit sequences ending suddenly. These disruptions reflect not only military conquest, but the deliberate dismantling of institutions central to Celtic self-governance. By 52 BC, as Caesar confronted the coalition led by Vercingetorix, the Druids had become symbols of cultural continuity and, in Roman eyes, obstacles to imperial ambition. Classical accounts describe their influence on morale, diplomacy, and the spiritual interpretation of war. Archaeological layers from siege sites, such as Alesia, reveal ritual debris deposited shortly before or during conflict, animal bones, burned offerings, and fragmentary weapons placed in pits near defensive lines. These acts suggest that Druids continued to guide ritual practice even as legions advanced, maintaining cosmological order amid the chaos of war. The encounter between Rome and the Druidic order reached its decisive turning point during the Gallic Wars. In the aftermath, Rome launched a systematic campaign to eradicate Druidic authority, recognizing that as long as the intellectual and ritual infrastructure survived, resistance could be rekindled. The next chapter traces this collapse, examining the archaeological and historical evidence for the destruction of Gaulish Druidism under Roman conquest. When Julius Caesar crossed into Gaul in 58 BC, the encounter between Roman imperial ambition and Druidic authority entered its decisive phase. Archaeological evidence from the mid-1st century BC reveals widespread disruption across central and northern Gaul, burned sanctuaries, fortified Oppida under siege, and ritual landscapes abruptly abandoned. These layers, rich in charcoal and collapsed architecture, marked the violent unraveling of a system that had endured for centuries. As excavators peel back these charred deposits, the faint scent of ancient smoke and burnt clay rises from the soil, evoking moments when ceremonial centers, once alive with voices, offerings, and seasonal rites, fell silent under the weight of Roman engineering and military discipline. Caesar's campaigns, described in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, targeted not only warriors, but the intellectual and ritual foundations of Celtic society. The Druids, custodians of law, memory, and cosmology, stood directly in the path of this transformation. The early years of the conquest reveal a consistent Roman strategy: destabilize political alliances by dismantling the ritual institutions that sustained them. Archaeological excavations at sanctuaries along the Seine, Marne, and Saône show signs of deliberate destruction: broken standing posts, smashed votive offerings, and boundary ditches filled hastily with debris. Radiocarbon dating of these layers aligns closely with the chronological arc of Caesar's advance. At sites such as Gournay-sur-Aronde, where generations had deposited weapons in ceremonial pits, the sequences end abruptly. The final layers contain objects left in disarray, suggesting forced abandonment rather than structured ritual closure. The cold, metallic scent released from freshly exposed iron fragments hints at the suddenness with which these places were deserted. These disruptions reflect not only the movement of armies, but the targeted dismantling of sacred spaces central to Druidic authority. Caesar's commentaries describe Druids as intermediaries capable of uniting tribes and influencing decisions that affected the entire region. His strategic objective, therefore, went beyond defeating warriors. It required severing the intellectual networks that underpinned intertribal cohesion. Archaeological evidence from Oppida such as Avaricum, Novaeodonum, and Bibracte reveals how Roman assaults destroyed the very settings where Druids presided over law and ritual. At Avaricum, layers of ash and collapsed ramparts testify to the devastation inflicted during the siege. Among the debris, pottery fragments displaying residue of feasting and ritual libations suggest gatherings that occurred shortly before the Oppidum's fall. The faint sweetness of wine absorbed into these sherds evokes scenes of last assemblies where Druids may have offered counsel, recited omens, or sanctioned decisions in the face of imminent destruction. The subsequent silence in these ritual sequences marks the interruption of traditions that had guided communities for centuries. The most dramatic confrontation occurred during the uprising led by Vercingetorix in 52 BC. Archaeological investigations at Alesia, the site of the coalition's final stand, reveal both the scale of Roman siege engineering and the traces of ritual activity carried out under duress. The Roman circumvallation, trenches, palisades, towers encircled the hilltop, cutting off escape and communication. Within the Oppidum, archaeologists have discovered refuse pits containing animal bones, broken drinking vessels, and fragmentary weapons burned shortly before deposition. These materials, when examined in situ, emit faint traces of charred grain and bone, suggesting hurried ceremonies conducted to maintain cosmological order during siege. The structure of these pits implies acts of offering, likely overseen by Druids in an effort to fortify morale and reaffirm ancestral continuity. Classical accounts note that Druids encouraged resistance by reminding warriors of the soul's immortality, teachings consistent with centuries of ritual tradition. Yet the siege of Alesia ended in defeat. Following Vercingetorix's surrender, Roman forces dismantled defensive structures and reorganized the landscape, leaving behind destruction layers that correspond to the sudden cessation of ritual activity. Excavations reveal that key sanctuaries were abandoned, their offerings left incomplete, their fires left extinguished. The abrupt break in ritual deposition sequences across Gaul suggests systematic suppression. Caesar's writings claim that he forbade Druidic assemblies and targeted their leaders, a statement supported indirectly by the disappearance of ceremonial construction and the severe decline in ritual artifacts dated after mid-1st century BC. Although local practices persisted in some rural areas, the institutional framework of the Druids, schools of learning, regional judicial authority, and trans-tribal networks collapsed under Roman occupation. The suppression of Druidism formed part of Rome's broader administrative strategy. By eliminating a class capable of uniting tribes through shared cosmology and law, Rome facilitated the imposition of provincial governance. Archaeological traces of early Roman temples, military forts, and administrative centers often appear directly above or adjacent to former sanctuaries, suggesting intentional replacement of sacred landscapes. The heavy stone foundations of Roman structures, when contrasted with the subtle post holes of earlier Celtic sanctuaries, embody a shift from oral, landscape-rooted authority to monumental imperial presence. As Gaul fell under Roman control, the Druids faced exile, execution, or erasure from public life. Yet their influence did not disappear entirely. Instead, it migrated geographically and conceptually, finding its last stronghold across the sea in Britain. After the fall of central and northern Gaul, the suppression of Druidic authority proceeded with an intensity reflected as much in the archaeological record as in the textual accounts. Roman policy toward the Druids did not rely on mass annihilation. Rather, it targeted the cultural infrastructure that supported their influence. Sanctuaries once central to intertribal diplomacy ceased operation, ceremonial landscapes fell silent, and ritual deposition sequences that had persisted for centuries came to an abrupt end. Excavations at sites in the Paris Basin, the Ardennes, and central Gaul show that shrines once reconstructed generation after generation were suddenly abandoned. Thin layers of windblown sediment sealing ceremonial pits and burnt posts indicate years of disuse following conquest. When archaeologists lift these layers, the faint smell of dried soil and extinguished charcoal reveals an absence rather than a violent termination, ritual life fading under administrative pressure rather than battlefield destruction. This quiet erasure reflects Rome's methodical dismantling of the Druidic order. Roman authorities replaced Druidic functions with administrative institutions embedded in military and civic structures. The establishment of Roman fora, temples, and magistrate courts created parallel frameworks of law and authority that bypassed traditional Celtic systems. Archaeological remains from early Romanized settlements, including Lyon, Lugdunum, and Orton, Augustodunum, show a rapid proliferation of inscriptions, stone temples, and civic monuments, forms of ideological architecture that contrasted sharply with the ephemeral timber sanctuaries of Druidic tradition. The smooth, carved surfaces of these Roman altars, illuminated by Mediterranean architectural principles, signaled a new visual order designed to assert imperial presence. Beneath some of these structures lie the faint traces of earlier Celtic ritual sites, post holes, shallow ditches, and burnt horizons, buried beneath heavy stone foundations. The superimposition of Roman monumental architecture over Celtic sacred space reveals a deliberate strategy: overwrite the memory of Druidic authority through durable, visible symbols of Roman control. Legal suppression accompanied architectural replacement. Classical sources suggest that Druidic assemblies were banned shortly after the conquest, and although direct textual confirmation from Gaulish regions is scarce, archaeological sequences support this interpretation. Hill forts once used for judicial gatherings show no continued ceremonial use after the mid-1st century BC. Soil compaction layers, once dense from foot traffic, become thin and irregular, indicating abandonment. Feasting areas associated with arbitration events likewise go silent. The concentrations of animal bones and drinking vessels characteristic of these gatherings disappear from the archaeological record. The sensory cues that once defined these spaces, the smell of roasting meat, the smoke curling above communal hearths, are absent from later deposits. These gaps reflect the erosion of communal mechanisms that had sustained social order through ritual and memory. With assemblies dissolved and sanctuaries abandoned, the role of Druids as custodians of legal tradition collapsed. Economic transformation further weakened Druidic networks. Roman taxation, land redistribution, and new trade routes reorganized the flow of goods across Gaul. Harbor excavations at Narbonne, Bordeaux, and Nantes reveal intensified maritime trade, while inland markets developed standardized weights, measures, and monetary systems. These changes reduced the importance of the ritual obligations that had previously governed exchange. The structured deposition of goods along trade routes, once overseen by Druidic ritual specialists, ceased almost entirely. In place of votive deposits, archaeologists find Roman coins, stamped amphorae, and imported ceramics, signaling a shift from cosmologically anchored exchange to monetized commerce. The fading presence of ritual offerings along rivers and pathways reflects the diminishing influence of Druids in regulating economic life. Yet even as their institutional roles disintegrated, traces of resistance persist in archaeological contexts associated with localized uprisings. In regions such as Armorica, Aquitania, and the Ardennes, certain sanctuaries continued limited use into the early years of Roman occupation. These sites contain late deposits characterized by hurried placement, broken weapons, small ornaments, and animal remains arranged without the structured patterns typical of earlier periods. The brittle, disordered fragments recovered from these contexts suggest desperate attempts to maintain ritual continuity under pressure. Such offerings hint at communities turning to their remaining ritual specialists for guidance in a world transformed by conquest. These last echoes of Gaulish ritual life capture the final efforts to preserve cosmological order in defiance of Roman restructuring. But the most significant development following the suppression of Gaulish Druidism was geographic rather than cultural. While the institutions of Druidic authority dissolved across the continent, they endured across the Channel, where Roman control had not yet penetrated. Archaeological evidence from Britain during this period, continued grove maintenance, active sanctuaries, and ongoing ritual deposition, shows that the islands remained a sanctuary for Druidic practice. As Gaul came under imperial rule, Britain emerged as the final center of the Druidic intellectual tradition, preserving functions that had vanished from continental Europe. By the late 1st century BC, the cultural silence spreading across Gaul's ritual landscapes contrasted sharply with the vitality of Druidic practice in Britain. Archaeological sequences from the Thames Valley, Anglesey, Cornwall, and the Severn Basin reveal a continuation, and in some regions, an intensification of ceremonial activity precisely during the decades when Gaulish sanctuaries fell dormant. These findings confirm the testimony of Roman writers who described Britain as a repository of Druidic knowledge. While Gaul experienced structural erasure, Britain preserved ceremonial groves, maintained ritual deposition practices, and upheld systems of oral law. Excavations at ritual sites such as Hayling Island and Lynserig Batch provide material evidence for this resilience. The waterlogged deposits at Lynserig Batch, containing chain sets, iron weapons, chariot fittings, and crafted ornaments, span decades that coincide with the suppression of Druidic practice on the continent. When archaeologists raise these objects from peat and silt, their cold, water-worn surfaces evoke an unbroken thread of ritual continuity. Britain remained intact as a sanctuary of cosmology and ceremonial expertise. The survival of Druidic institutions in Britain cannot be attributed solely to geography, although the physical barrier of the Channel clearly slowed Roman pressure. Social and political structures within Britain supported the persistence of ritual authority. Hillforts such as South Cadbury, Danebury, and Traprain-Law show continued occupation into the early 1st century AD, with ceremonial zones maintained and occasionally expanded. Soil micromorphology from these sites reveals repeated gatherings around hearths associated with ritual feasts. The residue of charred grain and animal bone indicates ceremonies conducted in stable cycles, uninterrupted by the disruptions that reshaped continental Gaul. These activities provided opportunities for Druids to continue their functions as teachers, legal arbiters, and ritual mediators. Unlike Gaul, where Roman administrative systems quickly replaced indigenous governance, Britain retained its intertribal councils, ritual assemblies, and networks of sanctuary sites long after Caesar's departure. Trade patterns further bolstered British autonomy. Although some Mediterranean goods reached southern Britain, amphorae, metalware, and glass beads, the volume was modest compared to the flows that transformed the Rhône and Garonne corridors. Excavations at Hengistbury Head, the primary continental gateway for British trade, show that imported goods remained limited and selectively integrated. The faint resin scent that arises from excavated amphora sherds at the site contrasts with the overwhelming quantities found in Gaulish middens, illustrating the difference in scale. With less economic dependence on Rome, British elites maintained traditional structures of authority in which Druids played central roles. Ritual deposition along rivers, marshes, and hilltops continued without interruption, reinforcing the cosmological order that had endured for centuries. The intellectual continuity visible in the British archaeological record also suggests that advanced Druidic instruction relocated from Gaul to the islands. Classical authors note that those seeking the deepest training in Druidic doctrine traveled to Britain, where teachings were preserved more fully. While textual references are filtered through Roman interpretation, material evidence supports the existence of specialized centers of ritual learning. Pollen analysis from certain groves in Anglesey, the Severn Basin, and the West Country indicates centuries of careful management, with species composition remaining stable across the very period when Gaulish groves were abandoned or destroyed. These botanical signatures provide a living record of continuity, revealing landscapes maintained through deliberate ritual stewardship long after their continental counterparts were severed from communal memory. The filtered light reconstructed from these ancient groves, soft, green, and steady, evokes the sensory atmosphere conducive to oral teaching and philosophical instruction. Moreover, Britain's political fragmentation, while posing challenges to collective defense, paradoxically supported Druidic endurance. Without a single dominant tribal power vulnerable to Roman manipulation, ritual authority operated through decentralized networks of sanctuary sites and assemblies. Archaeological evidence from the Upper Severn, Wessex, and the Welsh Marches shows consistent forms of ceremonial architecture, suggesting coordinated cosmological frameworks rather than centralized political structures. These networks facilitated the movement of ritual specialists, ensuring transmission of lore and philosophy across regional boundaries. The recurrence of similar ritual motifs, spiral engravings, paired deposits, burnt offerings, across vast distances underscores this cohesion. Despite this resilience, Britain's continuity was not indefinite. Roman imperial policy had already demonstrated that Druidic institutions would be deliberately targeted whenever conquest became viable. Caesar's withdrawal in 54 BC postponed the confrontation, but it did not erase Rome's memory of the Druids' influence in Gaulish resistance. Archaeological evidence from early Roman fortlets on the Kentish coast, temporary camps, marching lines, and supply depots indicates reconnaissance rather than permanent occupation. Yet these traces foreshadow the campaigns that would unfold almost a century later. By the late 1st century BC, Britain stood as the last stronghold of Druidism, an intact ceremonial world maintaining ancient rhythms in defiance of continental collapse. It preserved the intellectual systems, ritual cycles, and sacred geographies that Rome had extinguished in Gaul. But the island's autonomy would not remain unchallenged. As imperial expansion resumed under Claudius in 43 AD, Britain became the stage for the final struggle between Rome and the Druidic order. When the Roman Empire launched its invasion of Britain in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius, it confronted not only a landscape of hill forts and tribal alliances, but a cultural system in which Druidic authority still operated at full strength. Archaeological evidence from the decades preceding the invasion shows uninterrupted ceremonial use of groves, river sites, and wetland sanctuaries across southern and western Britain. Ritual deposition at Lyn Cerrig Batch continued into the early 1st century AD, with iron chains, weapons, chariot components, and ornate fittings placed deliberately in waterlogged contexts. When these artifacts are lifted from peat after centuries of saturation, the cold slickness of their surfaces evokes the continuous thread of practice preserved even as Gaul succumbed to rapid cultural restructuring. Britain, unlike the continent, retained the intellectual and ritual coherence that made Druids key arbiters of law, cosmology, and political guidance at the moment Rome advanced upon the island. The Roman invasion strategy reflected both military calculation and an awareness of the symbolic importance of Druidic networks. Early campaigns, documented archaeologically through temporary camps, marching lines, and supply depots stretching from Kent toward the Thames Basin, targeted tribal centers that coordinated regional alliances. Excavations at these Roman camps reveal orderly ditch systems, standardized tent placements, and supply pits filled with amphora fragments and animal bones, material signatures of rapid occupation by disciplined forces. Yet Rome's approach was not merely territorial. Classical texts attribute to Roman generals a strategic understanding that Druids served as unifying intellectual forces. Archaeological evidence from British Oppida, such as Camulodunum, Colchester, shows layers of destruction dated shortly after conquest, suggesting deliberate dismantling of ceremonial areas adjacent to political centers. The scent of burnt clay and charred timber in these layers evokes abrupt ruptures in ritual life, mirroring earlier patterns observed in Gaul. Despite Roman advances, Druidic authority persisted, especially in regions where geographical barriers slowed imperial control. In western Britain, Wales, the Marches, and parts of Cornwall, hill forts and sacred groves continued to function as centers of communal identity. Excavations at sites like Tre Saeri and Cefn Caer show minimal early Roman interference, with ceremonial structures in some locations showing signs of continued maintenance. Soil micromorphology from these areas reveals stable compaction patterns around ritual hearths, suggesting recurring gatherings. The faint aroma of charcoal released from these hearths during excavation provides a sensory reminder of rituals still performed under the canopy of ancient woodlands. Druids remained active in these regions, enforcing customary law, training new initiates, and advising tribal leaders confronted with the pressures of occupation. The most vivid archaeological and textual testimony to the endurance of Druidic practice appears in Anglesey, Unis Mon, which classical authors identify as the principal center of Druidic instruction and ritual authority. Excavations around Lyn Serig Bach, as well as on nearby elevated sites, show a density of deposits unmatched elsewhere in Britain. The waterlogged conditions preserved objects with exceptional clarity: horns, sword blades, cauldrons, and chain sets, indicating sustained offering practices. These offerings span centuries and continue into the early Roman period, underscoring the island's long-standing significance as a ceremonial heartland. The landscape itself, characterized by rugged coastlines, lake-filled interior valleys, and sheltered groves, created natural settings conducive to ritual seclusion. Pollen analysis from sacred grove sites on Anglesey reveals centuries of careful woodland management, with oak, yew, and hazel preserved in stable compositions. The filtered light reconstructed through these botanical signatures evokes an environment ideal for the oral instruction and cosmological teaching attributed to Druids. As Roman control expanded, Anglesey's symbolic and strategic importance grew. The island's position along the Menai Strait provided natural defense, while its ritual authority anchored cultural resistance across Western Britain. Classical accounts portray Druids as central figures in encouraging opposition, and while these narratives are filtered through Roman ideology, archaeological evidence of continued ritual activity suggests that spiritual and political leadership remained intertwined. Deposits made in the final decades before the Roman assault contain a notable concentration of objects related to warfare: spearheads, shield fittings, and chariot components, placed in lakes and wetlands. Their cold metallic surfaces, preserved through centuries of saturation, evoke offerings that merged martial identity with the cosmological order Druids sought to preserve. Yet the survival of these practices did not go unnoticed. As the Roman presence solidified across southern and eastern Britain, commanders increasingly recognized that suppressing military opposition alone would not secure long-term control. The Druids, as custodians of collective memory and interpreters of cosmic order, provided ideological cohesion that could outlast military defeat. Thus, Anglesey became the focal point of a decisive campaign aimed at dismantling the last intact Druidic institution in Britain. The Roman advance toward Anglesey unfolded through a combination of strategic necessity and ideological intent. Archaeological traces from the mid-1st century AD show Roman forces tightening their control across Wales, establishing auxiliary forts and marching camps that formed a corridor toward the Menai Strait. Excavations at Caerswas, Fortingaya, and Castle Colin reveal standardized fort layouts: rectangular enclosures, V-shaped ditches, timber barracks, and granary foundations, indicating permanent occupation rather than temporary raids. These installations, meticulously planned and supplied, formed a military lattice designed to isolate Anglesey from the mainland. The compacted, gravel-rich surfaces of parade grounds uncovered at these sites evoke the disciplined rhythms of Roman drill, in stark contrast to the organic pathways that had long defined local ceremonial landscapes. Every structural layer speaks to Rome's calculated intention: weaken the networks that sustained Druidic authority before launching the final assault. Classical sources describe Anglesey as the intellectual center of Druidic learning, and archaeological evidence aligns closely with this claim. Across the island, traces of ritual practice persist deep into the early Roman period. Excavations near Maltreath Marsh, for instance, reveal wetland deposition sequences containing weapon fragments, bronze fittings, and organic materials preserved in anaerobic conditions. These offerings bear signs of deliberate placement, their spatial patterns consistent with structured rites rather than casual disposal. When lifted from peat, the waterlogged objects release a faint mineral odor that suggests centuries of ceremonial continuity. Pollen cores taken from adjacent groves show consistent woodland management dominated by oak and yew, tree species deeply embedded in Druidic cosmology. Such botanical stability, preserved even as the continent's groves vanished, underscores the island's resilience as a ritual heartland. As Roman control expanded into Western Britain, leaders recognized that Anglesey's symbolic and practical importance extended beyond its geography. It served as a sanctuary for ritual specialists who preserved oral law, trained new initiates, and coordinated opposition through shared cosmological frameworks. Certain hilltop sites on the island show layers of intensified activity during the decades preceding the Roman assault: pottery fragments, feasting debris, and hearth ash indicating repeated gatherings. Soil micromorphology reveals dense compaction around these hearths, suggesting large assemblies convened for instruction, arbitration, or preparation for resistance. The faint aroma released when these ash layers are examined evokes moments when communities sought guidance beneath canopies of ritual authority. To Roman commanders, such gatherings represented not only cultural autonomy but an intellectual infrastructure that could regenerate resistance even after military defeat. Thus, the campaign against Anglesey was conceived as both a military operation and an ideological erasure. The assault itself, traditionally attributed to Suetonius Paulinus around 60 or 61 AD, is described vividly by Tacitus. Although his account contains rhetorical elements, its outline finds echoes in the archaeological landscape. Roman forces likely approached along the narrow strait, where strong tidal currents and shifting sandbanks complicated direct crossing. Excavations near the modern Menai Bridge reveal traces of timber structures, stakes, and potential landing points consistent with temporary Roman engineering. These features are fragmentary, yet their alignment and distribution suggest logistical preparations for either pontoon construction or coordinated boat landings. The jagged stone outcrops along the Anglesey shore, still visible today, frame a setting where Roman troops would have confronted not only physical obstacles, but an environment saturated with ritual meaning. Tacitus describes Druids lining the shore, raising their hands, chanting, and invoking curses as Roman troops advanced. While such dramatic imagery reflects classical literary conventions, archaeological evidence supports the idea that ritual specialists would have stood at the forefront of resistance. Deposits from nearby wetlands contain broken weapons and animal bones burned shortly before deposition, dating to the same decades as the assault. The charred residues, when exposed, release faint scents of burnt grain and bone, traces of rites likely performed in anticipation of confrontation. These offerings may represent acts of protection or appeals for cosmic balance, consistent with long-standing Druidic practice. Their presence near the strait emphasizes the symbolic gravity of the moment, the threshold of a world where ritual and sovereignty had long intertwined. Despite the weight of ritual authority, the Roman assault succeeded. Evidence of widespread burning across several sites on Anglesey, charcoal layers, collapsed structural remains, and abrupt abandonment of ceremonial zones confirms the destructive sweep described in textual sources. The thick, dark stratigraphy preserved at certain groves indicates deliberate felling and burning of sacred woodland. Sanctuaries show truncated post holes filled with ash rather than renewed construction layers, marking the end of centuries of ritual continuity. Even in waterlogged contexts, where offerings had continued for generations, deposition sequences halt suddenly in the years following the assault. This silence, layered into peat and soil, reveals the profound rupture inflicted by Roman terms of conquest. The fall of Anglesey marked the effective end of organized Druidism as a political and ritual institution in Britain. While elements of belief persisted in local practice, the intellectual and ceremonial networks that had defined the order for centuries were dismantled. Yet the eradication was neither immediate nor absolute. In the years that followed, fragments of Druidic memory survived, not in formal schools or sanctuaries, but in the subtler landscapes of custom, folklore, and place-based ritual. In the aftermath of Anglesey's fall, the archaeological and historical records both reveal a landscape undergoing rapid transformation. Ritual centers once central to Druidic instruction and intertribal cohesion fell abruptly silent. Excavations around the Menai Strait show layers of ash and compacted charcoal ceiling post holes that for centuries had been renewed with fresh timber. These sealed horizons, when cut open, release a faint scent of burnt oak, evidence of deliberate burning designed to prevent reconstruction rather than accidental fire. Surrounding these sites, the absence of subsequent ritual deposits is striking. Wetland sequences that had received offerings for generations terminate suddenly in strata datable to the early 60s AD. Timber trackways leading towards ceremonial zones collapse into disuse, overgrown by reeds and marsh plants that took root in the decades following the Roman assault. The sensory stillness of these reclaimed landscapes reflects a deliberate erasure of ritual infrastructure essential to Druidic continuity. Yet the suppression was not uniform. In more remote parts of Wales, the Marches, and northern Britain, small pockets of ritual activity persisted, though stripped of their former political significance. Excavations at certain upland sites reveal modest deposits, fragmented brooches, animal bones, small tools, placed carefully in shallow pits. These offerings lack the structured patterns characteristic of earlier centuries, instead suggesting private acts undertaken by individuals or small kin groups rather than orchestrated communal rites. Soil micromorphology around these deposits reveals minimal trampling, indicating that these sites no longer hosted large gatherings. When such objects are recovered from the soil, the earthy smell of undisturbed sediment contrasts with the stratified, ash-rich layers that once marked formal sanctuaries. These fragments of practice illustrate a transition. Ritual knowledge survived, but institutional Druidism did not. Some continuity also appears in the maintenance of groves far from Roman administrative centres. Pollen cores from secluded corners of northwestern Wales and parts of Scotland show uninterrupted presence of oak, yew, and hazel into the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD. These signatures suggest that certain woodland patches continued to be preserved despite imperial suppression. Though no longer associated with formal instruction, these groves may have served as quiet refuges for ritual memory, places where elements of Druidic cosmology were recited within families or transmitted informally. Filtered green light reconstructed from these pollen sequences evokes an atmosphere in which tradition persisted in muted form, no longer a public institution, but still a vessel for ancestral continuity. Meanwhile, Romanization advanced rapidly in regions integrated into the imperial economy. Urban centers such as Caerwent, Wroxeter, and Verulamium expanded across former ceremonial landscapes, their stone forums and rectangular street grids imposing new spatial order. Inscriptions introduced written law. Temples dedicated to Roman deities replaced earlier sanctuaries. The smooth limestone surfaces of these structures, now weathered but still distinct, signal the ideological shift from oral ritual governance to administrative bureaucracy. Archaeological layers beneath these cities contain remnants of earlier sacred zones, burnt soil, animal bones, or fragments of decorated wood, sealed beneath Roman construction. These layers preserve the final traces of Druidic influence embedded within the foundations of a new political world. Classical sources note that Druids were outlawed under Claudius and again under Nero, though enforcement varied by region. Archaeological evidence supports a gradual rather than instantaneous dissolution. Elite burials in Western Britain from the late 1st century AD occasionally contain objects associated with symbolic authority, mirrors, knives, or ornate jewelry, though no longer accompanied by offerings typical of Druidic rites. These grave reflect shifting identities under imperial rule, where older symbols persisted as heirlooms but no longer carried institutional significance. The polished surfaces of these mirrors, dulled by soil but still capable of catching light, evoke a memory of roles tied to introspection and ritual knowledge that now existed only as personal lineage rather than public office. By the late 1st century AD, Druidic authority had transitioned fully from public institution to cultural memory. Ritual specialists no longer arbitrated law or guided intertribal diplomacy. Their councils and sanctuaries lay silent under Roman oversight. Yet the intellectual structures they once sustained, the oral traditions, seasonal rites, and sacred geographies, did not vanish entirely. Instead, they migrated into folklore, local custom, and the mnemonic landscapes of rural communities. Traces persisted in seasonal festivals, in place names tied to groves and wells, and in the enduring respect for certain landscapes that had once served as nodes of cosmological meaning. This transition from institutional power to cultural echo marks the threshold into the final phase of the Druidic story. While Rome dismantled the visible structures of Druidic authority, it could not erase the deeper patterns of memory woven into Britain's landscapes, stories, and communal rhythms. After the Roman destruction of Anglesey and the dissolution of Druidic councils, Britain entered a period in which the outward structures of Druidism vanished, but its intellectual and ritual traces flowed into new channels. Archaeological evidence from the late 1st century AD shows that while formal sanctuaries ceased operation, certain ritual habits persisted in adapted or concealed form. Excavations at rural farmsteads and small settlements across Wales and Western Britain reveal isolated votive deposits, pottery sherds, animal bones, or small metal trinkets placed in wells, fence lines, or boundary ditches. These deposits, though modest compared to earlier ceremonial offerings, suggest continued belief in liminal spaces as points of connection between human and ancestral realms. When archaeologists recover these items, the faint earthy scent rising from compacted boundary soils evokes local acts of devotion that carried fragments of older cosmologies into everyday life. The persistence of such rituals illustrates that cultural erosion under Rome was uneven. Formal institutions disappeared swiftly, but intimate habits anchored in landscape memory endured. Sacred groves, despite their targeted destruction by Roman authorities, also exhibit a measure of continuity. Pollen cores from secluded valleys in western Britain show stable botanical compositions into the later 1st century AD, often dominated by oak, hazel, and birch. These signatures indicate that some communities continued to maintain small woodlands as protected spaces, even if stripped of their formal judicial and instructional roles. Soil micromorphology near certain groves reveals shallow hearths used intermittently, suggesting occasional gatherings for rites of passage or seasonal observances. The subtle aroma released from these ancient charcoal residues evokes small, private ceremonies conducted under the covert shelter of trees. Such practices retained elements of Druidic cosmology, respect for woodland, veneration of cyclical time, and ritual relationship with the natural world, while adapting to Roman surveillance and shifting political realities. Meanwhile, Roman religious architecture spread rapidly across Britain. Stone temples, altars, and votive niches appear in cities such as Caerwent, London, and Bath, each introducing new ritual frameworks centered on imperial cults and syncretic deities. Archaeological layers beneath these structures contain remnants of earlier British ceremonial sites, burnt soil horizons, animal bone concentrations, or timber post alignments, now sealed beneath heavy masonry. The juxtaposition of ephemeral Celtic features with durable Roman stone illustrates the ideological transition from oral, landscape-bound rituals to codified worship tied to empire. Yet this transition did not erase memory entirely. Local communities often incorporated native deities into Roman cults, creating hybrid practices documented through inscriptions dedicated to figures such as Nodens, Sules, and Maponus. These syncretic forms, recorded on stone but rooted in older oral tradition, reveal the adaptability of indigenous belief in the face of imperial expansion. The intellectual legacy of Druidism also took on new forms. While no Druidic writings survive, the oral traditions they once maintained persisted in the narrative structures of early medieval Britain and Ireland. Linguistic and poetic features characteristic of later Celtic literature, strict metrics, formulaic repetition, genealogical framing, reflect techniques honed in pre-Roman oral schools. Archaeological evidence supports this continuity through objects associated with status and learning found in post-conquest burials. Bronze mirrors, decorated knives, and symbolic ornaments appear in Grave well into the 2nd century AD, though reinterpreted as heirlooms rather than markers of institutional office. Their polished surfaces, dulled by soil but still capable of reflecting light, evoke memories of introspective roles tied to earlier intellectual functions. These artifacts, preserved alongside Roman goods, underscore the coexistence of old and new identity structures during the transition into provincial life. Place names provide another layer of continuity. Across Wales, Scotland, and Western England, names incorporating elements such as Derwa Oak, Nemeton Sacred Grove, and Bryn Hill Sanctuary indicate landscapes once shaped by Druidic activity. Archaeological surveys around some of these sites reveal subtle patterns, scattered charcoal layers, boundary ditches, or isolated votive pits that confirm long-term ritual association. The landscapes themselves became vessels of memory, transmitting echoes of Druidic cosmology even after formal rites had ceased. Their survival into the Roman period and beyond suggests that cultural memory persisted most strongly where tied to physical features of the environment, hills, groves, springs, that imperial structures could not entirely redefine. By the final decades of the 1st century AD, the Roman province of Britannia had stabilized. Roads, forts, and urban centers structured daily life, while taxation and legal administration formalized governance. Yet beneath this imposed order, fragments of the older intellectual system endured in oral tradition, local ritual, and landscape memory. These elements did not constitute organized Druidism, but formed the substrate from which later medieval traditions would draw inspiration. In the quiet continuity of festival rhythms, in the namming of hills and rivers, and in the inherited patterns of seasonal reverence, the shadow of the Druids remained. As the 1st century AD progressed, the cultural landscape of Roman Britain began to absorb traces of earlier Druidic cosmology into new, hybrid forms of ritual practice. Archaeological evidence from domestic shrines, small household altars, wall niches, and courtyard offerings reveals a blending of Roman and indigenous traditions. At villas in southern Britain, votive pits contain both Roman-style figurines and locally crafted objects whose symbolic grammar echoes pre-conquest cosmology. Small bronze offerings shaped into spirals or leaf motifs appear alongside mass-produced Roman lamps and miniature amphorae. When these mixed deposits are excavated, the faint mingling of scorched clay and earthy soil hints at rituals performed quietly within private households, preserving memory beneath the veneer of Roman religious forms. Though Druids no longer officiated, the symbolic vocabulary they cultivated endured in modified expressions of domestic devotion. Rural shrines also illustrate the persistence of older ritual habits. Excavations at countryside sanctuaries in Gloucestershire, Somerset, and the Welsh Marches reveal continued votive deposition into the late 1st century AD. Offerings placed in streams or springs, coins, brooches, pottery sherds, follow patterns reminiscent of earlier water-based rituals, though their scale is reduced and their symbolic context transformed. The cold clarity of spring water, where objects rest amid gravel beds, evokes a sensory continuity stretching back centuries. Soil chemistry analysis of these deposits suggests long-term patterns of small-scale devotion rather than organized rites. Such practices indicate that although Druidic authority had dissolved, the intuitive connection between natural features and spiritual significance persisted, carried forward by communities adapting older cosmologies to new imperial frameworks. At the same time, Roman administrative life introduced new rhythms that coexisted uneasily with these inherited traditions. Amphitheaters, bathhouses, and urban temples created communal spaces structured by Roman ritual and civic identity. Archaeological remains from these environments, inscriptions, votive plaques, and altars, contrast sharply with the ephemeral features of earlier British sanctuaries. Their carved stone surfaces bear dedications not only to Roman gods, but also to syncretic deities that merged local and imperial attributes. In Bath, Aquae Sulis, for example, inscriptions honor the goddess Sulis Minerva, a fusion of local water deity and Roman wisdom goddess. The stone altars erected in her temple encapsulate a convergence of cosmologies, Roman orthodoxy layered onto indigenous reverence for sacred springs. The steam rising from the hot waters, recorded in mineral deposits along ancient channels, mirrors earlier associations between natural phenomena and divine presence. Though Druids no longer mediated these spaces, their worldview, rooted in the relationship between land and meaning, lingered within the syncretic cults that emerged under Roman rule. The persistence of oral tradition offers yet another dimension to Druidic afterlife. While Roman schooling introduced writing and rhetoric into elite households, local communities retained modes of storytelling that preserved fragments of pre-conquest lore. Archaeological evidence hints at this continuity through objects associated with performance and memory. Decorated bone flutes, small drums, and intricately carved wooden vessels found in rural settlements dating to the late 1st century AD. The faint tonal traces imagined from these instruments evoke communal gatherings where stories, genealogies, and myths continued to circulate long after Druidic institutions had vanished. Although such performances lacked the formal structure once enforced by Druidic teaching, their persistence demonstrates the resilience of narrative as a cultural stabilizer. Over time, these oral traditions would form the substrate upon which early medieval literature, especially in Ireland and Wales, constructed new expressions of identity rooted in ancestral memory. In some regions, continuity manifested through landscape-based rituals that remained untouched by formal Roman religion. Hilltops, river confluences, and ancient tree clusters continued to host occasional offerings well into the provincial period. Excavations at several upland locations in Wales and northern England reveal shallow pits containing charcoal, small ceramic fragments, or burnt grain. These modest deposits, lacking the structured patterns of earlier centuries, suggest spontaneous rites tied to seasonal markers or local grievances. The cool wind that sweeps across these elevated sites today mirrors conditions under which such acts were performed, linking sensory experience to the persistence of cosmological intuition. Though these practices no longer belonged to an institutional system, their survival underscores the durability of landscape-based spirituality that had once been central to Druidic cosmology. By the final decades of the 1st century AD, Britain's cultural identity reflected a synthesis of Roman administrative order and inherited indigenous memory. Druidic institutions had been dismantled, but their intellectual echoes persisted in syncretic cults, in rural ritual practices, in narrative structures, and in the landscapes that continued to anchor meaning. These remnants did not constitute a continuation of Druidism, but rather a diffusion of its principles into the broader cultural fabric of Roman Britain. The afterlife of the Druids emerged not through resistance, but through quiet adaptation, carried forward in subtle habits, seasonal observances, and the enduring power of place. As the 1st century AD drew to a close, the transformation of Britain under Roman rule entered a phase in which indigenous memory no longer operated in institutional form, but persisted through quieter, more localized channels. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a gradual stabilization of rural life, punctuated by subtle expressions of continuity that trace their lineage to pre-conquest cosmologies. In remote valleys and upland pastures, excavations uncover small clusters of buried offerings, animal bones, broken brooches, or pottery sherds, placed within boundary ditches, house foundations, or natural hollows. These deposits, though modest, suggest a worldview in which land remained imbued with spiritual resonance. When archaeologists lift these objects from compacted earth, the faint, organic scent of undisturbed soil evokes acts of devotion carried out quietly within a world now structured by Roman taxation, law, and civic ritual. Such gestures reveal how belief systems rooted in Druidic cosmology adapted to new conditions without entirely dissolving. Literary echoes of this transitional period appear indirectly in the narrative traditions that emerged centuries later in Wales and Ireland. Although the surviving medieval texts were written long after the Roman occupation, their structure, themes, and mnemonic patterns point to deep roots in pre-Roman oral tradition. They preserve motifs of sacred trees, enchanted lakes, prophetic figures, and warriors bound by obligations to landscape and lineage, motifs that align closely with the archaeological record of earlier ritual life. While these texts cannot be treated as direct windows into Iron Age thought, their stylistic features, formulaic repetition, genealogical framing, and structured cycles reflect systems of memory cultivated in Druidic schools. The persistence of such elements suggests that fragments of earlier intellectual frameworks endured through centuries of adaptation, carried not by institutions, but by the cumulative work of storytellers who inherited the rhythms of older cosmologies. Roman Britain itself became a palimpsest in which layers of identity overlapped without fully eradicating earlier meanings. Urban centers like Verulamium and Wroxeter introduced monumental architecture, inscribed law, and standardized timekeeping, yet rural communities often retained cosmological habits tied to agricultural cycles rather than Roman calendars. Archaeological surveys of farmsteads show storage pits and seasonal enclosures rebuilt in rhythms that reflect natural cycles rather than civic schedules. The granaries, hearths, and boundary markers preserved in these contexts emit faint traces of smoke, grain, and weathered timber during excavation, sensory cues that call to mind the continuation of seasonal practice beneath the surface of Roman administration. These continuities demonstrate that while imperial governance reshaped political structures, it could not fully replace the deeper temporal habits that had long connected people to land. Shrines dedicated to syncretic deities provide additional evidence of cultural persistence. At Bath, where the cult of Suli's Minerva flourished, excavations reveal thousands of votive offerings, coins, tablets, jewelry deposited in the sacred spring. Although presented in Roman form, the devotion expressed through these offerings retains an older understanding of water as a medium between realms. The mineral deposits on coins lifted from the spring's depths capture a sensory record of centuries immersed beneath rising steam. Similar patterns appear at other Romano-British shrines where local deities merged with Rome's pantheon. These hybrid cults served as vessels through which indigenous cosmology adapted rather than vanished, allowing landscapes once shaped by Druidic ritual to retain spiritual meaning in altered form. By 100 AD, the afterlife of Druidic memory existed not in councils, sanctuaries, or formal instruction, but in the quiet persistence of place. Hills once aligned to ceremonial horizons still dominated local geography. Groves preserved through generations continued to cast filtered light across secluded clearings. Rivers that had received centuries of offerings still carved the same paths through valley floors. Archaeological evidence shows that these landscapes continued to attract ritual attention long after organized Druidism had disappeared. The enduring power of these places reveals that the deepest legacy of the Druids lay not in institutional structures, but in the way they embedded cosmology into land, season, and story. Their teachings survived not as doctrine, but as habit, woven into the ways communities interacted with environment, memory, and tradition. The history of the Druids, traced across 8 centuries, from 800 BC to 100 AD, moves from emergence to flourishing, from suppression to transformation. Their intellectual system shaped law, ritual, and identity across Britain and Gaul. Their authority bound communities through shared cosmology. Their legacy endured in landscapes that continued to hold meaning long after their institutions fell. As the Roman world expanded and reshaped the fabric of life in the northwest provinces, the Druids vanished from public view, yet echoes of their worldview persisted in the rhythms of rural practice, in the syncretic forms of Romano-British religion, and in the later literature that preserved fragments of ancestral memory. The story closes not with an ending but with a transition, as ancient knowledge, once spoken beneath the canopy of sacred groves, settled quietly into the land itself, waiting in the contours of hills, the clarity of springs, and the persistence of oral tradition to be carried forward into new eras of history.